Welcome, wanderers. As the moon hangs heavy and the world outside falls silent, let the shadows in your room deepen and your guard fall. For the next 3 hours, we're diving into tales of the chilling and the unknown. Stories specifically crafted to lull you into an uneasy rest. So dim the lights, pull up your blankets, and prepare to drift into a slumber haunted by whispers from the dark. Comment down below where you're listening from and drop a like in the name of fear. The old hunting lodge, nestled deep within the Blackwood Peaks, wasn't just remote. It felt like a scar on the face of the earth. Its weathered timber walls sagged, its windows were perpetually misted, and a perpetual chill clung to its very stones, even in the height of summer. For Liam, Chloe, Sam, and Maya, it was meant to be an escape, a desperate attempt to outrun the silent, suffocating weight that had settled over their lives. They had been inseparable since college, a quartet bound by shared dreams and late-night talks. But somewhere along the winding road of adulthood, the light had faded. Liam, the quiet artist, hadn't touched a brush in months, his studio gathering dust like a forgotten tune. Chloe, the outwardly cheerful one, maintained her bright facade with a terrifying fragility, her eyes betraying a deep, unyielding weariness. Sam, the cynical joker, found his wit turning bitter, his laughter hollow. And Maya, the meticulous academic, was drowning in a sea of research papers she could no longer comprehend, her sharp mind dulled by an endless fog. Their collective depression, a silent, insidious fifth member of their group, had become an unspoken pact of misery. The idea for the retreat had been Chloe's, a last-ditch effort to reconnect with nature and ourselves. Liam had nodded vaguely, Sam had snorted a sarcastic remark about therapy in the wilderness, and Maya had merely stared at her laptop screen, unseeing. Yet they had come. Anything was better than the suffocating familiarity of their own apartments, each a monument to their individual despair. The lodge, however, offered no solace. The moment they stepped inside, the chill intensified, a damp, clinging cold that seeped into their bones, no matter how many layers they wore. It wasn't just the temperature. It was a pervasive sense of profound emptiness, a vacuum that seemed to suck the very air from their lungs. The air hung thick with the scent of damp earth, decaying wood, and something else, something subtly metallic, like old pennies or dried blood. Their first night was filled with forced cheer. Chloe unpacked board games. Sam poured cheap whiskey. Liam stared into the crackling, reluctant fire, and Maya tried to read, her eyes scanning lines without registering meaning. But the lodge seemed to listen. Every creak of the old timbers, every groan of settling foundations, felt amplified, deliberate. The silence between their strained conversations was heavy, expectant. Then came the sounds. It started subtly, a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from the walls of Liam's room, directly behind his bed. Not frantic, like a mouse, but slow, deliberate, almost purposeful, like nails dragging on plaster. He tried to rationalize it, a loose floorboard in the room above, a branch against the exterior. But the tapping persisted, a maddening rhythm that often continued for hours, sometimes accompanied by a faint, almost inaudible whimper, like a child crying from a great distance, choked and desperate. He'd press his ear against the cold plaster, straining to hear, but the moment he focused, the sound would invariably fade, leaving him in the oppressive, damp silence of his room. Sleep became a luxury, stolen in fitful, restless bursts. Chloe, meanwhile, found herself plagued by phantom laughter. Not the joyful sound she so desperately tried to project, but a thin, reedy giggle that seemed to emanate from the empty corners of the kitchen, especially when she was alone, trying to force herself to cook. It was undeniably human, yet utterly devoid of warmth or joy, a sound of ancient, malicious amusement. She'd spin around, clutching a saucepan, only to find nothing but the oppressive silence and the pervasive cold. It made her forced smiles crack, revealing the raw despair beneath. Sam, ever the cynic, started hearing his own voice, distorted and mocking, whispering his deepest insecurities back to him from the shadows of the common room. Worthless. Failure. Everyone sees it. He'd snap back, "Shut up," only to be met with silence, and the chilling realization that no one else had heard it. His sarcasm became a frantic defense, aimed at invisible tormentors. Maya, in her attempt to find solace in logic, began to notice her meticulously organized research notes scattering themselves across the floor, or pages turning on their own in her open books. One night, she watched, horrified, as a pen rolled across the table and began to draw a series of intricate, swirling symbols on a blank page, symbols she didn't recognize, yet felt ancient and deeply unsettling. The air around her grew thick with the scent of ozone, like after a lightning strike. They tried to talk about it, huddled around the sputtering fireplace, their faces pale in the flickering light. "Are you guys hearing things?" Liam asked, his voice barely a whisper. Chloe nodded, her eyes wide and tearful. "The laughter, it's everywhere." Sam just stared into his whiskey glass. "My own damn voice, telling me I'm a joke." Maya, however, tried to rationalize. "It's the isolation, the stress, the old house settling. Our minds are playing tricks on us." But even as she spoke, her gaze darted nervously towards the shadows, her voice lacking its usual conviction. Their shared depression, instead of binding them against the encroaching horror, seemed to be amplifying it, making them more vulnerable, more isolated within their own minds. That night, the activity escalated. The tapping became bolder, more complex, tracing intricate patterns that sounded eerily like letters being carved into the plaster of Liam's bedroom wall. He pressed his ear to the cold, damp plaster again, trembling, and heard what sounded like faint, guttural chanting coming from deep within the lodge's infrastructure. A low, rhythmic hum that vibrated through the floorboards, a dark counterpoint to the frantic tapping. It was primal, ancient, like nothing he had ever heard, resonating with a disturbing, almost magnetic pull. And that clinging, damp cold intensified, bringing with it a new, disturbing scent. The faint, unmistakable smell of decay, like damp earth and something long dead, overlaid with the cloying sweetness of those phantom roses Chloe kept smelling, now sickly sweet and putrid. Chloe, unable to bear the laughter any longer, found herself drawn to the attic access panel in the ceiling of the hallway. The tapping was deafening here, a furious drumming. She could hear the distinct sound of something heavy dragging itself across the floorboards above, accompanied by a low, guttural groan. The giggling intensified, surrounding her, pressing in. She scrambled back, tripping over her own feet, collapsing in a heap on the floor. Sam, driven to the brink by the mocking whispers, started shouting at the empty air, his face contorted with rage and fear. He threw a whiskey bottle at the wall, shattering it, the crash echoing through the silent house. "Show yourselves, you cowards!" he screamed, his voice cracking. The whispers only grew louder, more numerous, a chorus of derision. Maya, desperate to find a logical explanation, stumbled into the lodge's small, dusty library. The books on the shelves seemed to pulse with a faint, internal light. She pulled out an old, leather-bound journal, its pages brittle with age. As she opened it, the symbols she'd seen drawn by the pen on her notes were scrawled across the first page, accompanied by archaic script. The air grew thick with ozone and the scent of decay. She began to read, her eyes widening in horror as she deciphered snippets. The sorrow feeds it, the despair strengthens it, a hunger for the broken. A piercing, unearthly shriek suddenly tore through the lodge, echoing from the attic. It was a sound of pure agony and malevolence, a sound that ripped through their already frayed nerves. The tapping stopped, the giggling stopped, the whispers ceased. A profound, echoing silence descended, heavier and more terrifying than before. Then, from the attic access panel, a dark, viscous liquid began to seep, slowly, inexorably, dripping onto the hallway floor. It was thick, black, and smelled of decay and that metallic tang. And from the darkness of the attic opening, something began to descend. It was impossibly thin, a series of undulating segments that writhed and pulsed in the dim light. Its skin was slick and glistening, a sickly gray-green, covered in faint, almost imperceptible scales. It had no discernible head or limbs, just a long serpentine body that coiled and uncoiled, slowly, deliberately, filling the space of the hallway. And from its surface, hundreds of tiny, iridescent orbs dripped, falling onto the dusty floor with soft, wet plinks, each one pulsing with a faint, hypnotic glow. This was the source. This was the provider Maya had just read about, the entity that fed on their despair. As the creature, or whatever it was, continued to emerge, the air grew thick with that cloying, sweet scent, mixed now with something truly vile, like stagnant water and rotting meat. The cold intensified, a physical pressure that seemed to squeeze the very life from them. The creature paused, its segmented body filling the entire hallway, its presence overwhelming. And then, from somewhere within its undulating mass, a single black, unblinking eye slowly opened. It was vast and ancient, reflecting the dim light, and it fixed on the four friends with an intelligence that was chillingly profound, utterly devoid of emotion, yet filled with an ancient predatory hunger. A voice, not heard with their ears but impressed directly into their minds, echoed in their skulls, a chorus of cold, ancient whispers. You crave, I provide. You consume, I grow. Your sorrow is my feast. Your despair, my sustenance. Liam stumbled backward, a choked gasp escaping his lips. Chloe let out a whimpering sob, her forced cheer utterly shattered. Sam stared, his cynicism replaced by pure, unadulterated terror. Maya dropped the journal, its brittle pages scattering, her academic mind reeling from the impossible, horrifying truth. The orbs on the floor pulsed, beckoning, but the sight of the creature, its vast, unblinking eye, and the chilling realization of its true nature, filled them with a horror that transcended even their deepest depression. This wasn't just a fix. It was a pact. They were its sustenance. The creature's segments began to twitch, and a single, long, translucent tendril uncoiled from its mass, reaching towards them. It moved slowly, deliberately, its tip dripping with the iridescent liquid. The despair in their guts screamed for it, but their minds recoiled. Run! Liam screamed, his voice raw, finally breaking free of his paralysis. They turned and ran, blindly, instinctively, a desperate primal flight. They scrambled through the living room, past the shrouded furniture, their feet slipping on the dusty floorboards. The lodge seemed to come alive around them, the shadows stretching, reaching, the cold intensifying, the scent of decay overwhelming. The walls groaned, the floorboards buckled, as if the entire structure was trying to swallow them whole. They reached the front door, their hands fumbling with the ancient lock, their fingers numb with terror. The creature's slithering was closer now, the scraping of its scales against the floorboards growing louder, a relentless pursuit. They could feel its presence behind them, the oppressive weight of its ancient hunger. With a desperate cry, Sam wrenched the door open, snapping the old lock, and they burst out into the night. The cool, damp air hit them like a shock, washing over their sweat-soaked skin, carrying away the cloying scent of the lodge. They didn't look back. They just ran, blindly, through the overgrown yard, past the skeletal trees, towards the faint, distant lights of Blackwood Peaks. They could hear the creature's low chuckle fading behind them, a promise of its patience, its endless wait. They ran until their lungs burned, until their legs gave out, until they collapsed on the side of the winding mountain road, gasping for air, tears streaming down their faces. The despair still clung to them, a familiar weight, but it was now laced with a new, terrifying knowledge. They had seen the face of their own darkness, and it had been hungry. They eventually found their way back to civilization, a small, lost group, their eyes haunted, their bodies emaciated. They tried to explain, to warn, but their words came out as choked sobs, incoherent babbling. No one believed them. They were just four depressed friends who had gone on a disastrous retreat. They never returned to the Blackwood Peaks. They abandoned all their belongings, their cars, their past lives within those walls. The cheap lodge had come at an unspeakable price, a price paid not in money, but in sanity. Months later, scattered across different cities, the nightmares still came. The tapping, the giggling, the whispers, the slithering, the black eye, but something had changed. The shared trauma, the sheer, undeniable horror they had faced together, had forged a new, fragile connection between them. They talked now, truly talked, about the lodge, about their despair, about the unspeakable thing that had fed on their sorrow. The shared secret was a bond, a dark anchor that paradoxically pulled them closer, a testament to their survival. Their depression wasn't cured, not entirely. The scars ran deep, etched into their very beings. But they faced it together now, no longer isolated islands of sorrow. Sometimes, when the night was utterly silent, Liam would still feel a lingering chill. Chloe would hear a faint, reedy chuckle. Sam would swear he heard his own mocking voice, and Maya would see faint, swirling symbols in the patterns of condensation on a window. And they knew, with a chilling certainty, that the old hunting lodge wasn't just an old building. It was a living, breathing entity, a monstrous maw waiting to consume the unsuspecting, its roots buried deep in something far older and far more terrifying than dust and forgotten secrets. And they were just 4 more offerings in its long, hungry history, forever marked by the night they escaped its insidious embrace. They were survivors, but they were also a testament to the insatiable hunger that lurked in the shadows, a hunger that had almost consumed them whole. They had escaped, yes, but they carried a piece of the lodge, and its despair, within them, a constant, chilling reminder of the darkness that had almost claimed them. The old St. Jude's Church stood on a forgotten hill, its stone facade crumbling, its stained glass windows opaque with grime. It wasn't merely old. It felt ancient, burdened by centuries of whispered prayers and unspoken sins. For Father Thomas, a man whose faith had long been eroded by the relentless tide of modern cynicism and personal tragedy, it was a last resort. Assigned to this desolate parish in the remote village of Ashwood, he saw it as either a penance or a final, desperate chance at redemption. He chose to believe the latter, clinging to the faint hope that a return to the fundamentals, to the quiet solitude of a forgotten place, might reignite the dying embers of his belief. The village itself was a collection of weathered cottages, their inhabitants as stoic and unyielding as the surrounding moorland. They eyed Father Thomas with a mixture of suspicion and resignation, their faces etched with a weariness that went deeper than age. They attended his sparse services, their voices flat during hymns, their eyes rarely meeting his. They spoke of the church in hushed tones, referring to it simply as the old place, never by name and always with a subtle shudder. From the moment Father Thomas stepped into St. Jude's, a pervasive cold settled over him. It wasn't the natural chill of a stone building. It was a damp, clinging cold that seeped into his bones, no matter how thick his cassock. It was worse in the evenings, a creeping dread that made him pull his threadbare stole tighter around him, even as the small, inefficient boiler wheezed in protest. It clung to the air, a constant, physical manifestation of an unseen presence. His first few weeks were a blur of solitary tasks, dusting ancient pews, polishing tarnished brass, trying to decipher the faded Latin inscriptions on forgotten tombs in the overgrown graveyard. The church was vast and empty, its high vaulted ceilings amplifying every sound, every movement, every whisper of his own breath. The air hung thick with the scent of damp stone, decaying wood, and something else, something subtly metallic, like old pennies or dried blood, mingled with the cloying sweetness of long-dead incense. The unsettling sounds. Then came the sounds. At first, he dismissed them as the natural groans of an old building. The creak of ancient timbers settling, the faint whistle of wind through broken panes in the bell tower, the distant hoot of an owl echoing from the surrounding woods. But they grew more distinct, more unsettling. A faint, rhythmic tapping would begin each night around midnight, originating from the sacristy, the small room where vestments were kept. It was soft, hesitant at first, like a child's fingers drumming on wood, then growing firmer, more insistent. Tap, tap, tap. It would go on for hours, a maddening, persistent rhythm that drilled into Father Thomas's skull. Even when he tried to pray, his rosary beads clutched tight in his trembling hands. He'd pound on the sacristy door, yelling, "Who's there?" His voice, thin and reedy, would vanish into the cavernous space, leaving only the relentless tapping as an answer. Sometimes the tapping would pause, only to resume moments later, accompanied by a faint, almost inaudible whimper, like a child crying from a great distance, choked and desperate. He'd press his ear against the cold, damp wood of the door, straining to hear, but the moment he focused, the whimper would invariably fade, leaving him in the oppressive, damp silence, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. Sleep became a luxury, stolen in fitful, restless bursts, punctuated by the phantom rhythm. The cold spot became more pronounced. It wasn't just the overall chill of the church. There was a specific area, the altar, that was always unnaturally frigid. Stepping into it was like walking into a meat locker, a sudden, shocking drop in temperature that made the hairs on Father Thomas's arms stand on end. And with the cold came a new, unsettling smell. A faint, cloying sweetness, like dried roses left too long in a forgotten vase, mixed with something distinctly metallic, like old blood, and something else, too, a faint whiff of stagnant water. One particularly damp evening, a storm raged outside, rain lashing against the grimy stained glass windows like handfuls of gravel, mirroring the tempest within Father Thomas's soul. The tapping intensified, frantic now, as if whatever was making the noise was desperately trying to get out, or perhaps desperately trying to get in. Father Thomas huddled in a pew, the sound of physical presence in the church, pressing down on him. Then, distinctly, over the drumming rain and the furious tapping, came a soft, almost amused giggle. It was thin, reedy, undeniably human, yet utterly devoid of warmth or joy. It was the sound of something old laughing, something that had seen too much, something that found amusement in human suffering. It seemed to come from the very air around him, a chilling, insidious mirth that wrapped around him like a shroud. His blood ran cold. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. This wasn't the wind. This wasn't an animal. This was something else. He scrambled from the pew, clutching his Bible, his eyes wide and unblinking in the pre-dawn gloom. He spent the rest of the night huddled in the sacristy, the faint glow of the sanctuary lamp a pathetic shield against the encroaching darkness. Every shadow seemed to writhe, every creak a stealthy footstep, every gust of wind a whispered name, a desperate search for answers. The next day, driven by a desperate need for answers, Father Thomas decided to brave the village. He sought out Old Man Hemlock, the oldest parishioner, a man whose eyes held the weary wisdom of generations. He found him tending a small, barren garden, his movements slow and deliberate, almost ritualistic. "Mr. Hemlock," Father Thomas began, trying to sound calm, "I've been hearing strange noises in the church, tapping and voices." Old Man Hemlock paused, his gnarled hands stilling over a patch of withered herbs. His eyes, pale and sharp, fixed on Father Thomas's face, a gaze that seemed to pierce through his exhaustion and fear, seeing something beyond. A long, drawn-out sigh escaped his lips, smelling faintly of damp earth and something else, something like ancient fear. "Noises, Father?" he rasped, his voice like rustling leaves, dry and brittle. "That church, it has always been prone to noises, especially at night." He looked back at his garden, but his body language was stiff, guarded, almost defensive. "You hear voices." The way he pronounced the word sent a chill down Father Thomas's spine, his tone shifting, laced with a strange, knowing sorrow that spoke volumes more than his words. "Just a whisper, maybe a giggle," Father Thomas stammered, feeling foolish as the words left his mouth, yet unable to stop himself. A flicker of something, recognition, pity, fear, crossed Old Man Hemlock's weathered face, gone as quickly as it appeared. He plucked a dead leaf from a plant, crushing it in his hand. "Don't pay it mind, Father," he finally said, his voice dismissive, but his eyes held a strange, distant glint, as if looking at something far beyond the present moment, a vista of unseen horrors. Some places, they just hold on to things. Best leave them be. The conversation was clearly over. His denial, though subtle, was too quick, too absolute. It confirmed Father Thomas's fears, rather than alleviated them. It was a warning disguised as dismissal, a plea to let sleeping horrors lie. The church comes alive. That night, the activity escalated beyond anything Father Thomas had experienced. The tapping became bolder, more complex, tracing intricate patterns that sounded eerily like letters being carved into the plaster of the sacristy wall. He pressed his ear to the cold, damp plaster again, trembling, and heard what sounded like faint, guttural chanting coming from deep within the church's foundations. A low, rhythmic hum that vibrated through the stone floor, a dark counterpoint to the frantic tapping. It was primal, ancient, like nothing he had ever heard, resonating with a disturbing, almost magnetic pull. And that clinging, damp cold intensified, bringing with it a new, disturbing scent. The faint, unmistakable smell of decay, like damp earth and something long dead, overlaid with the cloying sweetness of those phantom roses, now sickly sweet and putrid. The sanctuary lamp, usually a steady, unwavering flame, began to flicker wildly, casting grotesque, shifting shadows across the altar. The crucifix seemed to twist, its wooden form contorting in the dancing light. Father Thomas, unable to bear the laughter and the chanting any longer, found himself drawn to a heavy, iron-bound door set into the floor near the altar. It was a door he'd noticed but dismissed as a disused storage space. The tapping was deafening here, a furious drumming. He could hear the distinct sound of something heavy dragging itself across the floorboards beyond the door, accompanied by a low, guttural groan. The giggling intensified, surrounding him, pressing in, mocking his deepest fears. He scrambled back, tripping over his own feet, collapsing in a heap on the cold stone floor. He looked around, desperate for a sign, a clue. His gaze fell upon an ancient, leather-bound missal left open on the altar. Its pages were brittle with age, the Latin script faded. As he knelt, his trembling fingers traced the words. And then he saw them, the same swirling, intricate symbols that had appeared on the sacristy wall were scrawled in the margins of the missal, accompanying archaic script. His eyes widened in horror as he deciphered snippets. The sorrow feeds it, the despair strengthens it, a hunger for the broken. It grows with their grief, the offering. The air grew thick with ozone and the scent of decay. A piercing, unearthly shriek suddenly tore through the church, echoing from the very depths of the building. It was a sound of pure agony and malevolence, a sound that ripped through his already frayed nerves, freezing him in place. The tapping stopped, the giggling stopped, the whispers ceased. A profound, echoing silence descended, heavier and more terrifying than before, a vacuum of sound. Then, from the heavy, iron-bound door near the altar, a dark, viscous liquid began to seep, slowly, inexorably, dripping onto the stone floor. It was thick, black, and smelled of decay and that metallic tang. And from the darkness of the opening, something began to emerge. It was impossibly thin, a series of undulating segments that writhed and pulsed in the dim light. Its skin was slick and glistening, a sickly gray-green, covered in faint, almost imperceptible scales. It had no discernible head or limbs, just a long serpentine body that coiled and uncoiled, slowly, deliberately, filling the space of the altar. And from its surface, hundreds of tiny, iridescent orbs dripped, falling onto the dusty stone with soft, wet plinks, each one pulsing with a faint, hypnotic glow. This was the source. This was the entity the missal had described, the creature that fed on despair, the one for which the church was built as a conduit. As the creature, or whatever it was, continued to emerge, the air grew thick with that cloying, sweet scent, mixed now with something truly vile, like stagnant water and rotting meat. The cold intensified, a physical pressure that seemed to squeeze the very life from him. The creature paused, its segmented body filling the entire altar, its presence overwhelming. And then, from somewhere within its undulating mass, a single black, unblinking eye slowly opened. It was vast and ancient, reflecting the dim light, and it fixed on Father Thomas with an intelligence that was chillingly profound, utterly devoid of emotion, yet filled with an ancient predatory hunger. A voice, not heard with his ears but impressed directly into his mind, echoed in his skull, a chorus of cold, ancient whispers. You crave, I provide. You consume, I grow. Your sorrow is my feast. Your despair, my sustenance. Your faith, my meal. Father Thomas stumbled backward, a choked gasp escaping his lips. His faith, already so fragile, shattered completely. The orbs on the floor pulsed, beckoning, but the sight of the creature, its vast, unblinking eye, and the chilling realization of its true nature, filled him with a horror that transcended even his deepest despair. This wasn't just a fix, it was a pact. He was its sustenance. The church was its maw. The creature's segments began to twitch, and a single, long, translucent tendril uncoiled from its mass, reaching towards him. It moved slowly, deliberately, its tip dripping with the iridescent liquid. The despair in his gut screamed for it, but his mind recoiled. No! Father Thomas screamed, his voice raw, finally breaking free of his paralysis. He turned and ran, blindly, instinctively, a desperate primal flight. He scrambled through the pews, past the silent, watchful statues, his feet slipping on the dusty floor. The church seemed to come alive around him, the shadows stretching, reaching, the cold intensifying, the scent of decay overwhelming. The stone walls groaned, the floorboards buckled, as if the entire structure was trying to swallow him whole. He reached the heavy oak main doors, his hands fumbling with the ancient latch, his fingers numb with terror. The creature's slithering was closer now, the scraping of its scales against the stone floor growing louder, a relentless pursuit. He could feel its presence behind him, the oppressive weight of its ancient hunger. With a desperate cry, he wrenched the doors open, snapping the old lock, and burst out into the night. The cool, damp air hit him like a shock, washing over his sweat-soaked skin, carrying away the cloying scent of the church. He didn't look back. He just ran, blindly, through the overgrown graveyard, past the crumbling headstones, towards the faint, distant lights of Ashwood. He could hear the creature's low chuckle fading behind him, a promise of its patience, its endless wait. He ran until his lungs burned, until his legs gave out, until he collapsed on the side of the winding road, gasping for air, tears streaming down his face. The despair still clung to him, a familiar weight, but it was now laced with a new, terrifying knowledge. He had seen the face of his own darkness, and it had been hungry. He never returned to St. Jude's Church. He abandoned all his belongings, his vestments, his very identity within those walls. The cheap parish had come at an unspeakable price, a price paid not in money, but in sanity and faith. He left Ashwood that night, never looking back, a village now forever synonymous with horror. Months later, living in a small, anonymous room in a different city, the nightmares still came. The tapping, the giggling, the whispers, the slithering, the black eye, but something had changed. The sheer, undeniable horror he had faced had, paradoxically, stripped away his cynicism, leaving him with a raw, terrifying understanding of true evil. He no longer sought redemption. He sought only escape. His faith wasn't restored, not in the way he had once known it. The scars ran deep, etched into his very being. But he faced it now, no longer isolated in his sorrow. Sometimes, when the night was utterly silent, he would still feel a lingering chill, a phantom cold spot in the room, or swear he heard a faint whisper on the wind, a dry, reedy chuckle. And he knew, with a chilling certainty, that St. Jude's Church wasn't just an old building. It was a living, breathing entity, a monstrous maw waiting to consume the unsuspecting. Its roots buried deep in something far older and far more terrifying than dust and forgotten prayers. And he was just one more offering in its long, hungry history, forever marked by the night he escaped its insidious embrace. He was a survivor, but he was also a testament to the insatiable hunger that lurked in the shadows, a hunger that had almost consumed him whole. He had escaped, yes, but he carried a piece of the church, and its despair, within him, a constant, chilling reminder of the darkness that had almost claimed him. The old Blackwood Asylum, a sprawling, Gothic monstrosity of crumbling stone and shattered windows, wasn't just abandoned. It felt like a collective scream, trapped within its decaying walls. Its towering turrets pierced the bruised twilight sky, and a perpetual gloom clung to its very foundations, even under the harsh glare of the midday sun. For Dr. Eris Thorne, a disgraced psychiatrist haunted by a malpractice suit that had cost him his license and his reputation, it was meant to be a final, desperate act of defiance. He sought proof, a definitive answer to the whispers that had plagued his last patient, a young woman driven to madness by unseen tormentors. He believed the asylum held the key, a forgotten truth buried beneath decades of institutional neglect. But from the moment his rented car crunched onto the gravel drive, a subtle wrongness permeated the air. The usual tang of dust and decay was present, certainly coating everything in a fine layer of grit. Yet, beneath it all, there was a pervasive, unnatural cold. It wasn't the chill of the autumn morning, but a damp, clinging cold that seeped into his bones, no matter how thick his tweed jacket. It was a pervasive sense of profound emptiness, a vacuum that seemed to suck the very air from his lungs. The air hung thick with the scent of stale disinfectant, decaying plaster, and something else. Something subtly metallic, like old pennies or dried blood, mingled with a cloying sweetness, like lilies left too long on a forgotten grave. His first few hours were a blur of navigating the labyrinthine corridors, his flashlight beam cutting a weak path through the oppressive darkness. Patient records lay scattered, rusted restraints hung from crumbling walls, and the echoing silence was punctuated only by the occasional scuttle of unseen vermin. The asylum was vast and empty, its high ceilings and endless, dark tunnels amplifying every sound, every movement, every whisper of his own breath. The only real complaint was the persistent, almost imperceptible hum that seemed to emanate from the very ground, a low thrum that vibrated through the concrete floor, making it hard to truly focus on his self-appointed mission. The unsettling sounds. Then came the sounds. It started subtly, a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from somewhere within the thick concrete walls of the old hydrotherapy wing, directly behind a rusted, bolted door. It was soft, hesitant at first, like a child's fingers drumming on distant metal, then growing firmer, more insistent. Top, top, top. It would begin each time he paused, just as the last vestiges of twilight faded through a broken skylight, and continue for hours, a maddening, persistent rhythm that drilled into Eris's skull. Even when he tried to focus on his notes, he'd pound on the wall, yelling, "Hello? Is anyone there?" His voice, thin and reedy, would vanish into the oppressive silence, leaving only the relentless tapping as an answer. Sometimes the tapping would pause, only to resume moments later, accompanied by a faint, almost inaudible whimper, like a child crying from a great distance, choked and desperate. Eris would press his ear against the cold, damp concrete, straining to hear, but the moment he focused, the whimper would invariably fade, leaving him in the oppressive, damp silence, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. Sleep became a luxury, stolen in fitful, restless bursts, punctuated by the phantom rhythm. The cold intensified. It wasn't just the chill of the autumn air. It was a pervasive, bone-deep cold that seemed to emanate from the very foundations, from the very air. It clung to him, a constant, physical manifestation of an unseen presence. And with the cold came a new, unsettling visual. Fleeting shadows in the periphery of his vision, darting just beyond the reach of his sight, like dark figures slipping between the skeletal remains of patient beds, or indistinct forms moving in the swirling dust. When he turned, they were gone, leaving only the vast, empty expanse of the asylum. His scientific detachment, once his greatest strength, began to fray. The rational explanations he clung to felt increasingly thin. He found himself talking to himself, his whispers growing increasingly frantic about the patients. He developed a nervous tick in his eye, constantly scanning the shadows. He complained of persistent headaches and a metallic taste in his mouth. He tried to attribute it to the dust, the isolation, the sheer grind of his self-imposed investigation. But a growing unease gnawed at him. The feeling of futility, of endless, meaningless searching, seemed to deepen with each passing hour. One particularly dust-choked afternoon, a strong wind whipped through the broken windows, sending clouds of debris lashing against the remaining structures, mirroring the tempest within Eris's soul. The tapping intensified, frantic now, as if whatever was making the noise was desperately trying to get out, or perhaps desperately trying to get in. Eris huddled in a former nurse's station, the sound of physical presence in the room, pressing down on him. Then, distinctly, over the howling wind and the furious tapping, came a soft, almost amused giggle. It was thin, reedy, undeniably human, yet utterly devoid of warmth or joy. It was the sound of something old laughing, something that had seen too much, something that found amusement in human suffering. It seemed to come from the very air around him, a chilling, insidious mirth that wrapped around him like a shroud. His blood ran cold. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. This wasn't the wind. This wasn't a hallucination. This was something else. He scrambled from his chair, clutching his medical bag, his eyes wide and unblinking in the pre-dawn gloom. He spent the rest of the night huddled in a padded cell, the faint glow of his phone a pathetic shield against the encroaching darkness. Every shadow seemed to writhe, every creak of the old metal a stealthy footstep, every gust of wind a whispered name, a desperate search for answers. The next day, driven by a desperate need for answers, Eris sought out the asylum's abandoned archives, a room he'd previously avoided, fearing the sheer volume of forgotten suffering. He found it behind a heavy, warped wooden door, its lock long rusted away. The air inside was thick with the smell of mildew and decaying paper. He found a series of patient journals, their pages brittle with age. He began to read, his fingers trembling. The entries were chilling, detailing escalating madness, not from mental illness, but from external torment. Patients describing the whispers, the tapping, the cold that eats at you. One entry, dated over a century ago, spoke of a presence that feeds on despair, on the broken minds. And then, deeper in the journals, he found it, scrawled in a shaky hand, identical to the symbols his last patient had drawn in her final, terrifying moments. Crude, yet unmistakable, swirling, intricate symbols etched across the margins. His eyes widened in horror as he deciphered snippets. The sorrow feeds it, the despair strengthens it, a hunger for the broken. It grows with their grief, the offering, the long stay. And then, a familiar name, scrawled faintly in the margin. Thorn, not his first name, but his surname. A chilling coincidence, or something far more sinister? A piercing, unearthly shriek suddenly tore through the asylum, echoing from the very depths of the building. It was a sound of pure agony and malevolence, a sound that ripped through his already frayed nerves, freezing him in place. The tapping stopped, the giggling stopped, the whispers ceased. A profound, echoing silence descended, heavier and more terrifying than before, a vacuum of sound. Then, from the heavy, bolted door of the hydrotherapy wing, a dark, viscous liquid began to seep, slowly, inexorably, spreading across the concrete floor. It was thick, black, and smelled of decay and that metallic tang. And from the darkness of the opening, something began to emerge. It was impossibly thin, a series of undulating segments that writhed and pulsed in the dim light. Its skin was slick and glistening, a sickly gray-green, covered in faint, almost imperceptible scales. It had no discernible head or limbs, just a long serpentine body that coiled and uncoiled, slowly, deliberately, filling the space where the hydrotherapy tubs once stood. And from its surface, hundreds of tiny, iridescent orbs dripped, falling onto the dusty concrete with soft, wet plinks, each one pulsing with a faint, hypnotic glow. This was the source. This was the entity the journals had described, the creature that fed on despair, on the broken minds, on the very essence of human suffering. The one for which the asylum was its maw. As the creature, or whatever it was, continued to emerge, the air grew thick with that cloying, sweet scent, mixed now with something truly vile, like stagnant water and rotting meat. The cold intensified, a physical pressure that seemed to squeeze the very life from him. The creature paused, its segmented body filling the entire hydrotherapy room, its presence overwhelming. And then, from somewhere within its undulating mass, a single black, unblinking eye slowly opened. It was vast and ancient, reflecting the dim light, and it fixed on Eris with an intelligence that was chillingly profound, utterly devoid of emotion, yet filled with an ancient predatory hunger. A voice, not heard with his ears but impressed directly into his mind, echoed in his skull, a chorus of cold, ancient whispers. You crave, I provide. You consume, I grow. Your sorrow is my feast. Your despair, my sustenance. Your guilt, my meal. Your search for truth, my invitation. Eris stumbled backward, a choked gasp escaping his lips. His scientific detachment, his last bastion of sanity, shattered completely, replaced by pure, unadulterated terror. The orbs on the floor pulsed, beckoning, but the sight of the creature, its vast, unblinking eye, and the chilling realization of its true nature, filled him with a horror that transcended even his deepest despair. This wasn't just a research trip. It was a pact. He was its sustenance. The asylum was its maw. The creature's segments began to twitch, and a single, long, translucent tendril uncoiled from its mass, reaching towards him. It moved slowly, deliberately, its tip dripping with the iridescent liquid. The despair in his gut screamed for it, but his mind recoiled. No! Eris screamed, his voice raw, finally breaking free of his paralysis. He turned and ran, blindly, instinctively, a desperate primal flight. He scrambled through the asylum, past the forgotten cells and rusted equipment, his feet slipping on the dusty floor. The asylum seemed to groan around him, the shadows stretching, reaching, the cold intensifying, the scent of decay overwhelming. The walls buckled, the ground shook, as if the entire structure was trying to swallow him whole. He reached the main entrance, the heavy iron gates looming. His hands fumbled with the ancient lock, his fingers numb with terror. The creature's slithering was closer now, the scraping of its scales against the concrete growing louder, a relentless pursuit. He could feel its presence behind him, the oppressive weight of its ancient hunger. With a desperate cry, he wrenched the gates open, snapping the old chains, and burst out into the night. The cool, damp air hit him like a shock, washing over his sweat-soaked skin, carrying away the cloying scent of the asylum. He didn't look back. He just ran blindly through the overgrown grounds towards the faint, distant lights of the highway. He could hear the creature's low chuckle fading behind him, a promise of its patience, its endless wait. He ran until his lungs burned, until his legs gave out, until he collapsed on the side of the road, gasping for air, tears streaming down his face. The despair still clung to him, a familiar weight, but it was now laced with a new, terrifying knowledge. He had seen the face of his own darkness, and it had been hungry. He never returned to the Blackwood Asylum. He abandoned his car, his medical bag, his very identity within those walls. The search for truth had come at an unspeakable price, a price paid not in money, but in sanity. He left Blackwood that night, never looking back, a place now forever synonymous with horror. Months later, living in a small, anonymous apartment in a different city, the nightmares still came. The tapping, The giggling, the whispers, the slithering, the black eye, but something had changed. The sheer, undeniable horror he had faced had, paradoxically, stripped away his cynicism, leaving him with a raw, terrifying understanding of true evil. He no longer sought redemption. He sought only escape. His sanity wasn't restored, not in the way he had once known it. The scars ran deep, etched into his very being. But he faced it now, no new illusions. Sometimes, when the night was utterly silent, he would still feel a lingering chill, a phantom cold spot in the room, or swear he heard a faint whisper on the wind, a dry, reedy chuckle. And he knew, with a chilling certainty, that the Blackwood Asylum wasn't just an old building. It was a living, breathing entity, a monstrous maw waiting to consume the unsuspecting. Its roots buried deep in something far older and far more terrifying than dust and forgotten patient files. And he was just one more offering in its long, hungry history, forever marked by the night he escaped its insidious embrace. He was a survivor, but he was also a testament to the insatiable hunger that lurked in the shadows, a hunger that had almost consumed him whole. He had escaped, yes, but he carried a piece of the asylum, and its despair, within him, a constant, chilling reminder of the darkness that had almost claimed him. One morning, he woke up to the familiar tapping, not from a dream, but from the wall beside his bed. It was soft, hesitant at first, then growing firmer, more insistent. Top, top, top. And then, a faint, almost inaudible whimper. He pressed his ear against the cold plaster, and from within the wall he heard it, a soft, almost amused giggle. It was thin, reedy, undeniable human, yet utterly devoid of warmth or joy. It was the sound of something old laughing. He closed his eyes, a profound exhaustion settling over him. He was back. The asylum had found him, and this time he knew there would be no escape. The tapping continued, a maddening rhythm, inviting him back into the darkness. He was IT. The apartment, Unit 4B of the Blackwood Lofts, wasn't just old. It felt ancient, burdened by a century of lives lived and secrets buried within its crumbling brick facade. I, Clara Vance, a newly minted freelance writer escaping the suffocating familiarity of my hometown, had taken the cheapest available unit on the 4th floor, a spacious but perpetually dim studio overlooking a perpetually rain-slicked alley. The rent was impossibly low, a red flag I'd optimistically ignored. But in the relentless churn of urban life, a bargain was a bargain, even if it came with the faint, persistent smell of dust and something vaguely metallic. My first week was uneventful, filled with the usual unpacking and the distant, muffled hum of the city. My only real complaint was the persistent, almost imperceptible chill that permeated my apartment, even with the rattling radiator blasting. It wasn't just cold. It was a damp, clinging cold that seemed to seep into my bones, no matter how many layers I wore. It was worse in the evenings, a creeping dread that made me pull my threadbare blanket tighter around me, a physical manifestation of the profound loneliness that had followed me from my old life. The unsettling sounds. Then came the sounds. At first, I dismissed them as typical old building noises. Pipes groaning, wind howling through loose panes, the distant wail of sirens echoing off brick. But they grew more distinct, more unsettling. A faint, repetitive tapping seemed to emanate from the walls of my bedroom, directly behind my headboard. Not frantic, like a mouse, but slow, deliberate, almost purposeful, like nails dragging on plaster. I tried to rationalize it. Old wiring, settling foundations. But the tapping persisted, a maddening rhythm that often continued for hours, sometimes accompanied by a faint, almost inaudible whimper, like a child crying from a great distance, choked and desperate. I'd press my ear against the cold plaster, straining to hear, but the moment I focused, the sound would invariably fade, leaving me in the oppressive, damp silence of my small room. Sleep became a luxury, stolen in fitful, restless bursts, punctuated by the phantom rhythm. The cold spot became more pronounced. It wasn't just the overall chill of the apartment. There was a specific area, the corner near the old, unused fireplace that was always unnaturally frigid. Stepping into it was like walking into a meat locker, a sudden, shocking drop in temperature that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. And with the cold came a new, unsettling smell. A faint, cloying sweetness, like dried roses left too long in a forgotten vase, mixed with something distinctly metallic, like old blood, and something else, too, a faint whiff of stagnant water. One particularly damp evening, a storm raged outside, rain lashing against the windows like handfuls of gravel, mirroring the tempest within my soul. The tapping intensified, frantic now, as if whatever was making the noise was desperately trying to get out, or perhaps desperately trying to get in. I huddled under my thickest duvet, the sound of physical presence in the room, pressing down on me. Then, distinctly, over the drumming rain and the furious tapping, came a soft, almost amused giggle. It was thin, reedy, undeniably human, yet utterly devoid of warmth or joy. It was the sound of something old laughing, something that had seen too much, something that found amusement in human suffering. It seemed to come from the very air around me, a chilling, insidious mirth that wrapped around me like a shroud. My blood ran cold. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. This wasn't a pipe. This wasn't the wind. This was something else. I scrambled out of bed, pulling my blanket with me, my eyes wide and unblinking in the pre-dawn gloom. I spent the rest of the night huddled in the furthest corner of my living room, the faint glow of my phone a pathetic shield against the encroaching darkness. Every shadow seemed to writhe, every creak of the old wood a stealthy footstep, every gust of wind a whispered name, a desperate search for answers. The next day, driven by a desperate need for answers, I confronted Mrs. Petrov, the ancient, perpetually scowling building manager who lived on the first floor. Her apartment reeked of mothballs and stale cigarettes. Mrs. Petrov, I began, trying to sound calm. I've been hearing strange noises in my apartment, like scratching and voices. Her eyes, roomy and dark, fixed on mine. A long, drawn-out puff of smoke curled from her lips. Noises? She rasped, her voice like grinding gravel. Is old building. Always noises. She paused, her gaze unwavering. You hear voices? There was a strange emphasis on the word, a subtle shift in her tone that made my skin crawl. Just a whisper, maybe a giggle? I stammered, feeling foolish as the words left my mouth, yet unable to stop myself. A flicker of something, recognition, pity, fear, crossed her weathered face, gone as quickly as it appeared. She took another slow drag from her cigarette. Don't pay attention to it, she finally said, her voice dismissive, but her eyes held a strange, knowing glint. Is just the building settling? Is very old building? The conversation was clearly over. Her denial, though subtle, was too quick, too absolute. Confirmed my fears, rather than alleviated them. It was a warning disguised as dismissal, a plea to let sleeping horrors lie. The building comes alive. That night, the activity escalated beyond anything I had experienced. The scratching became bolder, more complex, tracing intricate patterns that sounded eerily like letters being carved into the plaster of my bedroom wall. I pressed my ear to the cold, damp plaster again, trembling, and heard what sounded like faint, guttural chanting coming from deep within the building's infrastructure. A low, rhythmic hum that vibrated through the floorboards, a dark counterpoint to the frantic tapping. It was primal, ancient, like nothing I had ever heard, resonating with a disturbing, almost magnetic pull. And that clinging, damp cold intensified, bringing with it a new, disturbing scent. The faint, unmistakable smell of decay, like damp earth and something long dead, overlaid with the cloying sweetness of those phantom roses, now sickly sweet and putrid. I couldn't stay in my apartment. Not another minute. Every shadow felt alive, every creak a stealthy step towards me. Grabbing my keys and phone, I fled into the dimly lit hallway, the faint glow of emergency lights doing little to dispel the gloom. The hallway itself felt different. The air was heavier, colder, the scent of decay stronger here, clinging to the peeling wallpaper and the frayed edges of the once grand runner. The light from my phone seemed to struggle against the oppressive darkness, barely illuminating the peeling wallpaper and stained carpet. As I walked, my bare footsteps echoing unnaturally loud, I noticed something new. On the wall opposite my apartment door, etched faintly into the peeling paint, were a series of symbols. They were crude, yet unmistakable, swirling, intricate designs that seemed to writhe and flow, almost identical to the ones I'd seen in an old, forgotten book from my library days, the ones that had haunted my dreams. My blood ran cold, a wave of nausea washing over me. This wasn't just my apartment. This was connected, part of something larger, darker, and infinitely more sinister. I hurried down the 4 flights of stairs to the ground floor, my heart pounding a frantic drum against my ribs. The chanting grew louder with each descending step, seeming to emanate from everywhere and nowhere, a disembodied chorus that pressed against my eardrums. The stairwell was a vortex of cold, dank air, each breath feeling heavy and thick. As I reached the ground floor, I saw something that froze me in my tracks. The main lobby, usually lit by a single weak bulb, was now bathed in an eerie, pulsing red light. It flickered erratically, casting grotesque, shifting shadows on the walls, making the antique furniture seem to writhe and contort like tortured figures. And then I saw the source. The ancient, heavy wooden door to the building's basement was ajar, a sliver of the pulsing red light escaping from within. From that gaping darkness, the smell of decay was overpowering, thick and cloying, making me gag. And the chanting, now a deafening crescendo, was clearly coming from below. It wasn't just chanting anymore. It was a frantic, desperate chorus of voices, layered on top of each other, speaking in a language I couldn't comprehend. Yet its tone was unmistakably one of supplication and terror, a chorus of pleading and agony. My legs felt like lead rooted to the spot. Every rational fiber of my being screamed at me to turn and run out the main door, to never look back, to flee Blackwood Lofts and never utter its name again. But the sight of those symbols, the chilling implication that this wasn't just my building, but part of a larger, darker tapestry, held me captive. The writer in me, the part that sought truth, however dangerous, compelled me forward. I had to know. I had to see. Slowly, hesitantly, I pushed the cellar door open further. The red light pulsed more intensely, bathing the descending steps in a hellish glow. The air was thick and heavy, like breathing liquid, a suffocating mixture of decay, ozone, and something else. Something distinctly metallic, like rust and old, congealed blood. The chanting was deafening, a relentless assault on my sanity, twisting my thoughts, blurring the line between reality and nightmare. It clawed at the edges of my consciousness, threatening to pull me under, to drown me in its ancient sorrow. I began to descend the creaking, wooden stairs, each step a descent into an ever-deepening abyss of horror. The walls of the stairwell were slick with condensation, gleaming with an unnatural sheen in the pulsing red light. As I went deeper, the temperature plummeted, the chill so profound it felt like needles piercing my skin, the air so cold it burned my lungs. The scratching I had heard in my apartment seemed to echo from every direction, multiplied 1,000-fold, as if countless unseen entities were tearing at the very fabric of the building, trying to break free. At the bottom of the stairs, a narrow, unlit corridor stretched into the impenetrable darkness. The pulsing red light spilled from a vast, open chamber at its end. I edged forward, my hands scraping against the rough, damp brick wall, the cold, gritty texture doing little to ground me. The floor beneath my feet felt uneven, almost spongy, squishing faintly with each step, a sickening sound in the oppressive silence. And then I saw them, faint, dark streaks on the floor, gleaming in the sporadic light, leading towards the red glow. They looked like drag marks, long, distinct trails, as if something heavy, something wet had been pulled through this darkness. The chanting in the chamber swelled, rising and falling in terrifying waves, a cacophony of agony and devotion. It was no longer just voices. there were other sounds mixed in. A wet, tearing noise like flesh being ripped. A soft, squelching sound like something being crushed underfoot. And then a low, guttural growl, deep and ancient, that vibrated through the very ground. A sound of immense, unfathomable hunger. I reached the entrance to the chamber and stopped, my breath caught in my throat, my eyes wide with disbelief and unspeakable terror. The room was immense, its true size obscured by the pulsing red light and shifting shadows that danced like tormented spirits. In the very center, on a raised, crudely constructed stone slab, was what looked like a massive dark mass. It pulsed with the same unsettling rhythm as the red light, its surface glistening wetly, reflecting the infernal glow. From it, thin, almost translucent tendrils snaked outwards, disappearing into the impenetrable shadows, like roots seeking nourishment or veins seeking blood. And kneeling around the slab, their bodies contorted into unnatural angles that defied human anatomy, their faces obscured by the pulsing light and self-inflicted wounds that oozed dark liquid, were a dozen or so figures. They were chanting, their voices raw and desperate, their hands raised towards the pulsating mass, their movements jerky and spasmodic, like puppets on invisible strings. They were dressed in tattered, archaic clothing, the fabrics rotted and clinging, their skin pale and almost translucent, stretched taut over visible bone. As the red light pulsed, I saw fleeting glimpses of something utterly horrifying. Their eyes were not human. They were black, vacant pools, reflecting only the infernal glow, devoid of all life and sanity. And their mouths were stretched open unnaturally wide, revealing rows of sharp, needle-like teeth, some stained dark, some dripping. The smell of decay was overwhelming, a sickening miasma that coated my tongue and burned my lungs, mixed with the metallic tang of fresh, coppery blood and something else, something fetid and unholy, a stench of pure, concentrated evil that seemed to cling to my very soul. Strewn across the floor around the slab were discarded bones, dark, viscous stains, and scattered, personal effects. A tarnished locket, a child's worn shoe, a broken pair of spectacles, each item a silent testament to a life brutally ended, a life offered. A chilling realization struck me. The whimpering, the giggling, the tapping, it had all been from them. The building wasn't just old. It was a charnel house, a factory of despair. The escape, one of the figures, thinner and more gaunt than the others, its hair a stringy, dark mess, suddenly rose. Its head snapped towards me, its movements jerky and unnatural, as if its neck had been broken and roughly reattached. It let out a piercing, unearthly shriek that ripped through the oppressive air, a sound of pure agony and malevolence, a sound that would forever haunt my nightmares. The other figures stopped their chanting, their heads slowly, synchronously turning towards me, their movements chillingly unified, their black, empty eyes fixed on me, a silent, predatory gaze that promised unspeakable torment, an ancient, boundless hunger. The pulsating mass on the slab seemed to throb faster, its tendrils quivering, elongating, reaching. My mind fractured. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. This was a nightmare, a hallucination brought on by sleep deprivation and the crushing weight of my own loneliness. But the overwhelming sensory assault proved it was terribly, viscerally real. My legs, which had been frozen in terror, suddenly found a surge of adrenaline-fueled strength. I turned and ran, blindly, instinctively, back towards the stairs, the piercing shrieks of the figures echoing behind me, joined by the sickening sound of their bare feet pounding on the stone floor, gaining on me, a relentless, inhuman pursuit. I scrambled up the steps, 3 at a time, my lungs burning, the cold, damp air tearing at my throat, each breath a desperate fight for survival. The chanting resumed below me, now frantic, furious, a chorus of rage and dark purpose, mixed with the terrifying growl of the entity on the slab, a sound of immense, predatory satisfaction. The red light pulsed through the cracks in the door, painting the stairwell in shifting hues of hell, each flicker a glimpse into an abyss. I could feel their presence behind me, the cold, stale breath of death on my neck, their formless, hungry touch brushing against my skin, raising goosebumps of pure horror. I burst out into the dimly lit lobby, gasping, shaking uncontrollably, my body racked with a terror I had never known. The main front door of the Blackwood Lofts, the heavy, imposing oak door that usually required a key, was now standing slightly ajar, a sliver of glorious, mundane street light peeking through. It was an invitation, a promise of escape, a beacon of hope in the overwhelming darkness. I threw myself against the door, pushing it open with a desperate surge of strength, scraping my hands raw against the splintered wood, and stumbled out onto the rain-slicked sidewalk. The cool night air hit me like a revelation, a cleansing wave washing over my sweat-soaked skin, carrying away the cloying scent of decay. The distant sounds of the city, the honking cabs, the chatter of late-night revelers, were a symphony of normalcy, a lifeline back to sanity. I didn't look back. I just ran, never stopping, never pausing, my bare feet slapping against the cold pavement, until the crumbling brick facade of the Blackwood Lofts was a distant, horrifying memory, swallowed by the darkness behind me. The lingering scars. I never returned to the Blackwood Lofts. I abandoned all my belongings, my few pieces of furniture, my books, my entire life within those walls. The impossibly low rent had come at an unspeakable price, a price paid not in money, but in sanity. I left the city that night, never looking back, a place now forever synonymous with horror. Months later, living in a small, anonymous apartment in a different city, the nightmares still came. The tapping, the giggling, the whispers, the slithering, the black eye, but something had changed. The sheer, undeniable horror I had faced had, paradoxically, stripped away my cynicism, leaving me with a raw, terrifying understanding of true evil. I no longer sought solace. I sought only escape. My loneliness wasn't cured, not entirely. The scars ran deep, etched into my very being. But I faced it now, no new illusions. Sometimes, when the night was utterly silent, I would still feel a lingering chill, a phantom cold spot in the room, or swear I heard a faint whisper on the wind, a dry, reedy chuckle. And I knew, with a chilling certainty, that the Blackwood Lofts wasn't just an old building. It was a living, breathing entity, a monstrous maw waiting to consume the unsuspecting, its roots buried deep in something far older and far more terrifying than dust and forgotten secrets. And I was just one more offering in its long, hungry history, forever marked by the night I escaped its insidious embrace. I was a survivor, but I was also a testament to the insatiable hunger that lurked in the shadows, a hunger that had almost consumed me whole. I had escaped, yes, but I carried a piece of the building, and its despair, within me, a constant, chilling reminder of the darkness that had almost claimed me. The scent of rosin and sweat clung to the air in the hallowed halls of the Volkov Ballet Academy, a perpetual perfume of ambition and sacrifice. Alara, a wisp of a girl with a steel spine and eyes that held the fierce fire of 1,000 suns, lived for this scent. Every muscle in her lithe body was a testament to years of grueling discipline, every ache a whispered promise of perfection. She was a rising star, a prodigy, but even in her talent, there was a shadow. The Academy, renowned for its rigorous training and unparalleled artistry, was also notorious for its legends, tales of dancers who pushed too far, who vanished, or who simply broke. Her current obsession, and the source of a growing unease, was the upcoming performance of the Obsidian Swan, a ballet whispered about with a mixture of reverence and dread. It was a rarely performed masterpiece, a ballet of such technical difficulty and emotional intensity that it was said to consume its lead dancers. The role of the Black Swan, in particular, was cursed, demanding a surrender so absolute that some believed it was less a performance and more a possession. The director, Madame Volkov herself, a woman whose stern gaze could wither even the most confident dancer, had chosen Alara for the lead. It was an honor, a dream come true, yet a cold dread settled in Alara's stomach. The previous lead, a brilliant but fragile dancer named Anya, had suffered a catastrophic injury during rehearsals, a snapped Achilles tendon, a career-ending rupture that had left her screaming on the stage, her cries echoing through the empty theater. Some said it was an accident. Others whispered of the swan's jealousy. As rehearsals for The Obsidian Swan began, the atmosphere in the Academy shifted. The usual competitive tension was replaced by a palpable, almost suffocating sense of dread. The music, a haunting, dissonant score by a forgotten composer, seemed to seep into the very stone of the building, echoing in the empty studios long after the pianists had left. Elara found herself practicing late into the night, driven by a relentless need to master the role, to embody the Black Swan's malevolent grace. It started subtly. The mirrors in the main studio, usually pristine, would sometimes show fleeting distortions in her reflection. A flicker of something gaunt and pale behind her, a pair of eyes that were not her own, wide with a silent, desperate agony. She'd spin, heart pounding, to find nothing but the empty studio, the cold, silent mirrors reflecting only her own exhausted form. The faint scent of something metallic, like old pennies or dried blood, would occasionally waft through the air, only to vanish as quickly as it appeared. Then came the sounds, faint whispers, like dry leaves skittering across the polished wooden floor when no wind stirred. The distinct, rhythmic tap-tap-tap of point shoes on the floor above, long after the last dancer had departed. Sometimes, a low, guttural sigh, like someone struggling for breath, would echo from the wings of the empty theater. Elara attributed it to the old building settling, to her own fatigue, to the immense pressure of the role. But the incidents grew bolder. She would leave her point shoes meticulously placed by her bag, only to find them later in the center of the studio, their ribbons untied, splayed as if they had just been danced in. Her practice costume, left neatly folded, would sometimes be found crumpled in a corner, or even draped over a ballet bar, as if a spectral dancer had used it. The faint metallic scent grew stronger, more persistent. The whispers began to coalesce into fragmented, chilling phrases. She dances, she suffers, the swan demands. They seemed to emanate from the very walls, from the shadows clinging to the corners of the studio, from the depths of the empty theater. The air around her grew noticeably colder, even in the heated studios, a bone-chilling cold that seeped into her very marrow. Sleep became a battleground. Nightmares, vivid and terrifying, plagued her. She dreamt of the Black Swan not as a character she danced, but as a living entity. In these dreams, the swan was a gaunt, skeletal figure, its eyes glowing with an internal, malevolent light, its point shoes clicking a relentless rhythm on an endless, dark stage. It would dance around her, its movements a grotesque parody of ballet, its long, bony fingers reaching for her, its whispers a deafening roar in her mind. Give yourself. Surrender. Become the swan. She jolted awake one night, heart hammering against her ribs, the scent of old blood thick in her nostrils. Standing at the foot of her bed, bathed in the pale moonlight filtering through the window, was a shimmering, translucent figure. It was vaguely human-shaped, but distorted, elongated, its limbs impossibly thin, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. It wore a tattered, dark tutu, and its feet were encased in what looked like ancient, blood-stained point shoes. It was Anya, or what was left of her. A silent scream tore through Elara's throat. The apparition raised a skeletal hand, its fingers beckoning, its mouth opening in a silent, agonizing gasp. Then, it recoiled, dissolving into the shadows of the room. Elara scrambled out of bed, fumbling for the light switch, her hands shaking so violently she could barely grasp it. When the room flooded with light, there was nothing. Only the lingering scent of decay and the profound, oppressive cold. She could no longer deny it. The legends were real. The Black Swan was not just a role. It was a curse, a hungry entity that consumed its dancers, binding their tormented souls to the Academy, forcing them to dance forever, spectral shadows in the halls of their former glory. Anya was just one of its victims, a new addition to its grim collection. Driven by a desperate need for answers, Alara began researching the ballet's origins. The Academy's archives, usually locked away, held a hidden section, dusty and forgotten. She found fragmented accounts of the ballet's composer, a reclusive and supposedly mad genius named Viktor Volkov, the great-grandfather of the current director. His journals, written in a frantic, almost illegible hand, spoke of a pact with the shadows, of infusing life into art, of a sacrifice for true perfection. The entries grew more disturbing, detailing how the music itself became a conduit, a binding spell, drawing in the essence of the dancers, their pain, their ambition, their very souls, to give the black swan its chilling vitality. He wrote of the hunger of the swan, its insatiable desire for more, for life. The more she read, the more the pieces of the puzzle clicked into place, forming a terrifying picture. The ballet wasn't just difficult, it was a ritual. The black swan wasn't just a character. It was a parasitic entity, a construct of dark magic and tormented souls, feeding on the life force of its performers, growing stronger with each one it consumed. The injuries, the breakdowns, the disappearances, they were all part of the swan's insatiable appetite. The air in the academy grew thick, heavy with an oppressive presence. The whispers intensified, no longer just fragmented phrases, but a chorus of dry, rustling voices, growing louder, closer, echoing Viktor Volkov's frantic scrawl. Give yourself, surrender, become the swan. You are ours now. One afternoon, during a solo rehearsal on the main stage, the lights in the theater flickered, then died, plunging the vast space into near total darkness. Only the emergency lights, casting long, dancing shadows, provided a meager illumination. Alara froze, her heart pounding. The whispers were all around her, a cacophony of tormented voices, pressing in, suffocating. Then she saw them, shimmering, translucent forms, dozens of them, drifting onto the stage from the wings, from the empty seats in the auditorium. They were the echoes, the spectral dancers, the previous victims of the Black Swan. They wore tattered tutus, their forms distorted, their limbs impossibly thin, their eyes glowing with a faint, internal light. They began to move, a silent, macabre ballet, their spectral point shoes clicking a chilling rhythm on the stage, a dance of eternal torment. At the center of them, taller, darker, more defined than the others, was the Black Swan itself. It was a terrifying figure, a skeletal ballerina, its head tilted, its empty eye sockets fixed on Alara. Its movements were fluid, graceful, yet utterly devoid of life, a chilling parody of perfection. It raised its long, bony arms, beckoning, its whispers a deafening roar in Alara's mind. Come, little swan, join us, dance forever. Terror, cold and absolute, seized Alara. But beneath it, a flicker of defiance ignited. She was a dancer. She understood rhythm, movement, control. She would not be another victim, another echo. She remembered a line from Viktor Volkov's journal, a fleeting, almost desperate note. The binding thread, woven with shadowed light, can be unraveled by pure, defiant sound. Pure, defiant sound. Not the haunting music of the ballet, but something else. Something alive. The Black Swan lunged, its skeletal fingers reaching for her. The echoes swirled around her, their cold presence suffocating, their whispers a chorus of temptation and despair. Alara dodged, her training kicking in, her movements a blur of desperate evasion. She saw the stage door, a sliver of hope. She scrambled towards it, the spectral dancers hot on her heels, their clicking point shoes a relentless pursuit. The Black Swan was faster, its movements impossibly swift. It was upon her, its cold, spectral hand closing around her ankle, pulling her down. She fell, scraping her knee on the polished floor. With a surge of desperate adrenaline, Alara grabbed a discarded music stand, pulling it over, creating a momentary barrier. As she scrambled to her feet, she fumbled for her phone, her trembling fingers barely able to unlock it. She opened a music app, selecting a track not classical, not ballet, but a vibrant, pulsating electronic beat, full of life and energy, a defiant rhythm against the deathly silence. She cranked the volume to maximum, the speakers blasting the defiant sound into the confined space of the theater. The effect was instantaneous. The echoes recoiled, their forms flickering violently, their whispers turning into a cacophony of pained shrieks, 1,000 tormented voices crying out in agony. The music, a vibrant pulse of life, a defiant beat of human creation, was anathema to their spectral existence, a burning light against their shadow, a force they could not comprehend or endure. The black swan shrieked, a sound like grinding bones, its form twisting and contorting, its hold momentarily weakening. Alara pressed her advantage, pushing the volume even higher, the music a shield against the encroaching darkness, a barrier against the whispers. She saw the faint glimmer of dawn on the horizon, a thin sliver of gray light breaking through the theater skylight, painting the stage with the promise of a new day. As the first direct rays of sunlight touched the stage, bathing the theater in a gentle golden glow, the black swan shrieked one last, agonizing time. Its skeletal form dissolved, fading into nothingness like mist in the morning sun. The echoes, deprived of their anchor, their malevolent conductor, flickered, wavered, and then vanished completely, their whispers dying into a profound, liberating silence. Alara stood panting, her body trembling, her mind reeling. The music still blared, a triumphant anthem of life. She had survived. She had broken the curse. She never danced again. The stage, once her sanctuary, was now a place of chilling memories. The scent of rosin and sweat now brought a wave of nausea. The sight of a ballet bar sent shivers down her spine. She left the academy, leaving behind the world of perfection and sacrifice, seeking solace in the mundane, in the comforting predictability of everyday life. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind howled outside her window, she would hear it a faint, almost imperceptible tap-tap-tap of point shoes on a distant, unseen floor, and a chilling, high-pitched giggle just at the edge of hearing, a sound that seemed to echo from the deepest recesses of her memory. She knew the black swan was gone, its curse broken, but the memory of its hunger, and the tormented echoes it had created, would forever haunt the hallowed halls of the Volkov Ballet Academy. And sometimes, just sometimes, a new, ambitious dancer, driven by the same relentless pursuit of perfection, would find themselves drawn to the obsidian swan, unaware of the chilling price of its artistry, unaware that some performances, once begun, never truly end. The air crackled with anticipation, thick with the intoxicating scent of high-octane fuel, burnt rubber, and the nervous sweat of 1,000 spectators. The Midnight Grand Prix, an unsanctioned, underground race, was less an event and more a legend, whispered about in the dark corners of the racing world. It wasn't about prize money or fleeting fame. It was about proving you were the fastest, the most fearless, the one who could tame the treacherous, winding roads of the Blackwood Pass. And, as whispered in hushed tones that carried the weight of ancient dread, it was about surviving the pass itself, a place where the road seemed to consume those who dared to challenge it. Rory Kincaid, a man whose life was a blur of speed and adrenaline, whose very pulse seemed to beat in time with a revving engine, gripped the steering wheel of his custom-built Phantom, a sleek, raven-black machine that purred with barely contained power, a predator waiting to be unleashed. His heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs, a familiar drumbeat before a race, a symphony of anticipation and controlled fear. But tonight, there was a different note in the symphony of his nerves, a discordant hum of unease that resonated deep within his bones. He'd heard the rumors, the chilling tales of drivers who vanished without a trace, of cars found mangled beyond recognition with no bodies inside, of spectral lights dancing in the rearview mirror, mocking the living. He usually scoffed at such superstitions, dismissing them as the fanciful ramblings of the weak-minded. But the atmosphere tonight was different, heavy with an almost tangible dread that clung to the air like the humidity before a storm. His rivals lined up beside him, their machines gleaming under the harsh floodlights, each a testament to engineering and a hunger for victory. There was Viper Valerius, a cold-eyed veteran with a reputation for ruthless aggression, whose steely gaze promised no quarter. Blaze Brennan, a flamboyant newcomer whose recklessness was matched only by his blistering speed, a wild card in every race, and the enigmatic Shadow, a driver whose identity was unknown, always clad in black from head to toe, their car a featureless, matte gray blur, a silent, almost invisible menace on the track. The tension was a living thing, a coiled serpent ready to strike. The starting gun cracked, a sharp, deafening report that echoed through the night, slicing through the roar of the crowd. Engines roared, a collective beast unleashed, a primal scream of power. Tires shrieked, biting into the asphalt with desperate urgency, leaving smoking trails in their wake, and the cars launched forward, a kaleidoscope of speed and light, blurring into streaks against the dark backdrop of the pass. Rory pushed the Phantom, feeling the raw power surge through him, the acceleration pinning him back against his seat, becoming one with the machine, a seamless extension of steel and speed. Blackwood Pass lived up to its ominous name. The road was a serpentine nightmare, a ribbon of asphalt clinging precariously to the side of a sheer cliff face, dropping into a bottomless gorge on one side, a gaping maw of darkness, and rising to a dense, ancient forest on the other, its trees like skeletal fingers reaching for the sky. Hairpin turns followed blind crests with cruel regularity, and the narrow asphalt offered no forgiveness for error, no mercy for the hesitant. The moonlight, when it broke through the heavy, scudding clouds, cast eerie shadows that danced and writhed, playing tricks on the eyes, transforming familiar shapes into grotesque specters. Rory was in his element, his instincts honed by years of pushing limits, his reflexes a blur of precision. He took the first few turns with practiced precision, his tires kissing the very edge of disaster, the cliff face a blurred wall beside him, his mind a calculating machine, processing every variable, every nuance of the road. He passed Blaze, whose car skidded dangerously close to the cliff edge, a near miss that sent a jolt through Rory, even as he focused on his own line. He saw Viper's determined face in his rearview mirror, a grim mask of concentration, a relentless hunter on his tail. Then, the first anomaly occurred, subtle at first, easily dismissed. As he rounded a particularly tight bend known as Widow's Kiss, a faint, ethereal glow appeared in his rearview mirror, not from a car's headlights, but a soft, pulsing luminescence, like a distant, dying star. It was behind Shadow's car, which was currently a few lengths back, a silent, unsettling companion. Rory blinked, shaking his head, trying to clear his vision. Just the glare of the lights, he told himself. Fatigue, perhaps, playing tricks on his overstimulated mind. But the glow persisted, growing brighter, seeming to pulse with a life of its own, an internal rhythm that defied explanation. It wasn't static. It moved, weaving and darting behind Shadow's vehicle, almost like a phantom passenger, a silent observer in the deadly race. Rory frowned, a knot forming in his stomach, pushing the thought aside with a desperate effort. Focus on the road. Focus on the race. He pulled ahead of Shadow, the Phantom's engine screaming in protest as he redlined it, pushing the machine to its absolute breaking point. As he glanced in his mirror again, the glow was still there, but now it was closer, directly behind him, a shimmering, indistinct form in the periphery of his vision, just beyond the edge of clear sight. He felt a sudden, inexplicable drop in temperature inside the cockpit, a chilling cold that seeped into his bones despite the roaring heat of the engine and his own adrenaline-fueled body. A profound shiver traced its way down his spine, a premonition of something terrible. The whispers began then, faint at first, like the rustle of dry leaves in a forgotten wind, or the distant murmur of a restless crowd. They weren't words, not yet, but a cacophony of dry clicks, faint sighs, and something that sounded uncannily like stifled laughter, a cruel, mocking sound that seemed to echo from the very depths of the gorge. It seemed to emanate from the very air around him, from the shadows clinging to the ancient trees, from the endless blackness of the gorge below. Rory gripped the wheel tighter, his knuckles white against the dark leather, his heart hammering a frantic, irregular beat. The adrenaline that usually sharpened his senses now seemed to amplify his unease, turning every shadow into a lurking threat. He pushed the phantom harder, the speedometer needle trembling at its maximum, trying to outrun the unsettling presence, to leave the whispers and the cold behind. The glow in his mirror intensified, becoming a swirling vortex of pale light, growing more defined, more menacing. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, forming fragmented, chilling phrases that seemed to claw at the edges of his sanity. Faster, not fast enough. You can't escape. We are waiting. Ahead, Blaze's car suddenly swerved violently, its tires losing traction with a desperate shriek that cut through the night. It spun once, twice, a chaotic dance of metal and light, then veered off the road with a sickening crunch, disappearing into the black maw of the gorge. No explosion, no fiery wreckage, no sign of life. Just silence, profound and absolute, where a moment before there had been the roar of an engine. Rory's blood ran cold, a chilling realization dawning on him. Blaze was known for his recklessness, but not for such a catastrophic, unforced error. It was as if something had pulled him off the road, an invisible hand guiding him to his doom. The glow in Rory's mirror pulsed, brighter now, an almost blinding luminescence, and the whispers coalesced into a chilling chorus, 1,000 voices speaking as one. One down. Who's next? The past hungers. It always hungers. He glanced at his GPS, his eyes darting from the road to the flickering screen. He was nearing Devil's Backbone, a series of treacherous S-curves notorious for claiming unwary drivers, a section of the road that demanded absolute precision. He saw Viper's car ahead, a red streak against the darkness, a defiant challenge to the lurking horror. Rory pushed the Phantom to its absolute limit, the engine screaming in protest, a banshee wail in the night, the tires barely holding traction as the car danced on the edge of control. As he entered Devil's Backbone, the glowing entity in his mirror seemed to expand, filling his entire rear view, its form becoming clearer, more terrifying. He could almost make out a skeletal, elongated shape within it, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, its empty eye sockets fixed on him with an ancient, malevolent gaze. The whispers were no longer whispers. They were a dry, rasping chorus directly in his ears. Inside his head, 1,000 voices screaming his name, demanding his surrender. We ride with you, Rory Kincaid. We ride with all who dare to challenge the past. And we claim our due. Your soul, your essence, your eternity. He felt a sudden, inexplicable drag on the steering wheel, a subtle resistance that fought against his every input, a powerful, unseen force trying to wrest control from him. The Phantom began to veer, inching closer to the sheer cliff edge, the abyss beckoning. Rory wrestled with the wheel, his muscles screaming in protest, his arms burning with the effort. It was as if an invisible hand, cold and strong, was trying to force him off the road, to join the others. He saw Viper's car ahead, struggling with the same unseen force. Viper's vehicle was fishtailing wildly, its tires smoking, its driver fighting a desperate battle against an unseen adversary, a silent, unseen battle for his very life. Then, with a final, agonizing shriek of tortured metal, Viper's car was violently ripped from the road, not swerving, but literally lifted and hurled into the abyss, a silent, sickening plummet into the darkness, a flash of red disappearing into the void. Rory screamed, a raw, primal sound of terror that tore from his throat, swallowed by the roar of the wind and the whispers. He was alone now, the last one. The glowing entity was no longer just in his mirror. It was in the passenger seat, a shimmering, translucent form, its skeletal fingers, long and bony, reaching for the wheel, for his throat. The whispers were a deafening roar in his mind, 1,000 voices screaming his name, demanding his soul, promising an eternity of torment. Join us, Rory. Become one of us. Ride the past forever. Feel the wind. Feel the cold. Feel the endless hunger. He felt the cold, spectral touch on his arm, a sensation of icy dread that seeped into his very bones, chilling him to the core. His vision blurred, the road ahead twisting and distorting into a grotesque mockery of reality. He was losing control not just of the car, but of his own mind, his sanity fraying at the edges. The entity was trying to possess him, to make him another echo in the past's grim collection, another spectral driver bound to this cursed road. He remembered the rumors, the stories of drivers who vanished. They didn't crash. They were taken. Their cars found empty. Their souls bound to the past, forced to ride forever, spectral guardians of this cursed road, luring new victims into the same inescapable fate. The past was a living entity, a hungry maw that devoured souls. With a surge of desperate adrenaline, a final, defiant spark of life, Rory fought back. He slammed his foot on the accelerator, pushing the Phantom beyond its limits, beyond what he thought was possible, a desperate gamble for survival. The car surged forward, a black bullet against the night, a defiant streak against the encroaching darkness. He swerved violently, hoping to dislodge the entity, to break its hold, to shake off the spectral grip. The entity shrieked, a sound like grinding stones, a sound of pure agony, its hold momentarily weakening, its form flickering like a dying flame. Rory saw his chance, a sliver of hope in the overwhelming darkness. He remembered a legend, a forgotten tale of the past, whispered by old-timers around dying campfires. The ancient ones fear the light of the dawn and the true sound of life. They cannot abide the vibrant pulse of the living. He fumbled for his phone, his trembling fingers barely able to unlock it, fumbling with the touchscreen. He opened a music app, selecting a track, not a racing anthem, not a metal roar, but a vibrant, pulsating electronic beat, full of life and energy, a defiant pulse against the deathly silence. He cranked the volume to maximum, the speakers blasting the defiant rhythm into the confined space of the cockpit, the bass vibrating through the very chassis of the car. The effect was instantaneous. The glowing entity recoiled, its form flickering violently, its whispers turning into a cacophony of pained shrieks, 1,000 tormented voices crying out in agony. The music, a vibrant pulse of life, a defiant beat of human creation, was anathema to its spectral existence, a burning light against its shadow. Rory pressed his advantage, pushing the Phantom even harder, the music a shield against the encroaching darkness, a barrier against the whispers. He saw the faint glimmer of dawn on the horizon, a thin sliver of gray light breaking through the oppressive blackness, painting the sky with the promise of a new day. The entity shrieked again, its form shrinking, its power waning, dissolving into wisps of shadow. As the first direct rays of sunlight touched the treacherous road, bathing the pass in a gentle golden glow, the glowing entity in his passenger seat dissolved completely, fading into nothingness like mist in the morning sun. The whispers died, replaced by the roar of the Phantom's engine and the frantic, pounding rhythm of his own heart, a testament to his survival. Rory drove on, his body trembling uncontrollably, his mind reeling from the ordeal, the phantom chill still clinging to his skin. He reached the makeshift finish line, a solitary victor in a race that had claimed all others, a survivor of an unseen horror. He pulled the Phantom to a screeching halt, collapsing against the steering wheel, gasping for breath, the taste of fear still bitter on his tongue. He never raced again. The thrill of speed was gone, replaced by the chilling, indelible memory of the spectral riders of Blackwood Pass. He sold the Phantom, unable to bear its presence, its silent reminder of the night he had cheated death and glimpsed the true horror of the road, a horror that lurked just beyond the veil of perception. Years passed. Rory lived a quiet life, far from the roar of engines and the whispers of the wind, seeking solace in the mundane, in the comforting predictability of everyday life. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind howled outside his window, a sound that once brought him peace, he would hear it, a faint, dry rustle, like leaves skittering across asphalt, and a chilling, high-pitched giggle just at the edge of hearing, a sound that seemed to echo from the deepest recesses of his memory. He knew the past still called, still claimed its due, still hungered for new souls. And he knew that somewhere, in the eternal darkness of Blackwood Pass, the spectral drivers still raced, their phantom cars a blur of light and shadow, waiting for the next brave fool to challenge their domain. Forever trapped in the midnight Grand Prix, forever riding the cursed road. The rain began just as the final bell shrieked. A sudden, cold downpour that turned the schoolyard into a blurry watercolor of gray asphalt and bright yellow raincoats. Alara pulled her thin, threadbare jacket tighter, hunching her shoulders against the biting chill as she joined the jostling throng of students rushing for the bus. She hated the bus. It was always too loud, too crowded, a suffocating metal box that smelled faintly of stale crisps, damp wool, and the faint, sickly sweet scent of disinfectant that never quite masked the underlying grime. But today, a deeper, more profound unease settled in her stomach, a prickle of dread that had nothing to do with the weather or the usual afternoon crush. It was a cold, internal shiver that started in her gut and spread through her veins. The usual chaos of the afternoon bus ride was strangely muted, almost entirely absent. The boisterous laughter of the older boys, usually a cacophony of adolescent energy, was subdued, reduced to barely audible mumbles. The incessant chatter and playful shouts of the middle schoolers, typically a constant buzz, had dwindled to hushed, almost fearful whispers that seemed to cling to the damp air. Even the bus driver, old Mr. Henderson, usually a jovial man with a booming laugh and a penchant for bad jokes, sat hunched over the wheel, his shoulders stiff, his back unusually straight, his eyes fixed on the rain-streaked road with an unusual, almost desperate intensity. The bus itself felt different, too. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered erratically, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to stretch and shrink with a life of their own, making the familiar interior seem alien and menacing. The engine hummed with a low, almost mournful whine, a sound that vibrated through the floorboards, up through Alara's worn sneakers, and into her very bones, a resonant thrum that felt less like machinery and more like a living, breathing thing. Alara found her usual seat, 3 rows from the back, by the window, where she could press her forehead against the cool glass and watch the world go by. Her best friend, Liam, usually saved it for her. His worn backpack sprawled across the seat, a silent invitation. But today Liam wasn't there. He hadn't been at school since Tuesday, and the teachers had just said he was unwell. Their voices tight, their eyes avoiding hers. Alara knew better. Liam had told her about the dreams, his voice trembling, his eyes wide with unshed tears, dreams of twisted trees reaching like skeletal hands from a perpetual mist, of whispering shadows that promised oblivion, of a cold, grasping hand reaching for him from the darkness beneath his bed. He'd looked pale and drawn, his usual spark dimmed to a flicker, like a candle about to gutter out. He'd barely eaten, barely slept, consumed by an invisible terror. As the bus pulled away from the school, the rain intensified, blurring the world outside into streaks of gray and green, transforming the familiar suburban landscape into an impressionistic blur. Alara pressed her face against the cold glass, trying desperately to distract herself, to focus on the distorted reflections of the streetlights, but her gaze kept drifting, irresistibly, to the other passengers. They seemed different. Their faces were pale, almost bloodless, their skin a sickly gray in the flickering light. Their eyes were wide and glassy, unnaturally still, fixed straight ahead, as if staring at something only they could see. They sat unnaturally stiff, their hands clasped tightly in their laps, their knuckles white, as if holding on to something precious, or perhaps holding themselves together, preventing some internal unraveling. Their breathing was shallow, almost imperceptible. A small, whimpering sound, barely audible above the engine's drone, broke the heavy silence. Came from the seat directly in front of Alara. A first grader, little Timmy, was clutching a worn teddy bear, its once fluffy fur matted and damp. His face was buried deep in its comforting embrace, but his shoulders shook with silent, convulsive sobs that seemed to vibrate through the seat back. His older sister, Sarah, usually so protective of her little brother, sat rigidly beside him, staring blankly out the window, seemingly oblivious to his distress, her face a mask of serene emptiness. Alara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the dampness seeping into her jacket. It was the chill of fear, cold and sharp. She leaned forward, gently tapping Sarah on the shoulder, her voice a hesitant whisper. "Sarah, is Timmy okay? He's crying." Sarah didn't respond. Her eyes remained fixed on the rain-streaked window, unblinking, unseeing. Alara tapped her again, a little harder, a faint tremor in her hand. Still nothing. Sarah's skin looked unnaturally waxy, almost translucent, in the flickering, erratic light, like old porcelain. A faint, almost imperceptible greenish tint seemed to shimmer beneath the surface of her skin, visible only when the lights flared brightest. A sudden, violent lurch of the bus sent a ripple through the passengers. Not a normal bump in the road, but a deliberate, almost organic shift, as if the bus itself had sighed. A collective sigh, like a soft exhalation of breath from 1,000 lungs, swept through the bus, a faint, rustling sound that made the hairs on Alara's neck stand on end. Alara pulled back, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. This wasn't right. None of this was right. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to escape. The bus continued its journey, taking what seemed to be the usual route, but each stop felt wrong, profoundly wrong. At the first stop, Mrs. Gable's house, a quaint cottage with a vibrant rose garden. No one got off. Mrs. Gable, a kindly old woman who always had a smile and a wave for the children, stood on her porch, a brightly colored umbrella clutched in her hand, her face pale, her eyes wide with a silent, desperate plea that Alara could almost feel. Mr. Henderson merely drove past, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, his gaze fixed straight ahead, as if he hadn't even seen her. At the next stop, the corner where the twins, Emily and Ben, usually raced off the bus, laughing and shouting, their backpacks bouncing. Today, they remained in their seats, their identical faces expressionless, their eyes vacant, reflecting the flickering lights like polished stones. Their mother stood at the bus stop, a worried frown on her face that slowly morphed into a look of growing panic, then outright terror, as the bus sped by, leaving her standing alone in the rain. Alara felt a knot of ice forming in her stomach, expanding, spreading through her chest. The bus wasn't stopping. It was just driving, and the passengers, they weren't reacting. They were like dolls, frozen in place, their silent, glassy stares fixed on some unseen point in the distance, a destination known only to them. She tried to call out, to scream, to shatter the suffocating silence, but her throat felt constricted, as if a cold, invisible hand was squeezing it, stealing her voice. She tried to move, to get up, to run to the front of the bus, but her limbs felt heavy, sluggish, as if she were moving through thick mud, or as if she were submerged in cold, viscous water. A strange, metallic taste filled her mouth, like old pennies left too long in the rain, or the taste of blood. The humming of the bus engine grew louder, deeper, transforming into a low, resonant thrum that seemed to vibrate inside her skull, a sound that was no longer mechanical but organic, alive. The fluorescent lights flickered faster, more violently, casting the interior of the bus in a strobe-like effect, making the still, pale faces of the passengers seem to twitch and distort, their features melting and reforming in the erratic light. The shadows danced, growing longer, reaching, twisting into grotesque shapes. Alara glanced at Timmy again. He was still whimpering, but now his whimpers were growing fainter, more distant, like an echo fading into nothingness. His teddy bear had slipped from his grasp, lying forgotten on the grimy floor. His eyes, once wide with tears, were now open, staring, and they held the same vacant, glassy quality as Sarah's, as everyone else's. The faint greenish tint on his skin was more pronounced now, like a delicate film of algae. A faint, sickly sweet smell, like the lingering scent of old flowers on a grave, or the cloying perfume of decay, began to permeate the air. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable, then grew stronger, cloying, thick, making Alara's head swim, her stomach churn. It was the smell of something ancient, something that had been buried and was now stirring. She looked out the window again, The familiar houses and shops, the comforting landmarks of her neighborhood, had given way entirely to dense, unfamiliar woods. The trees were unnaturally tall and dark, their branches gnarled and twisted into grotesque, skeletal forms, their leaves a deep, unnatural green, even in the driving rain, shimmering with an internal light. This wasn't her neighborhood. This wasn't the way home. This was nowhere she had ever seen before. A low, guttural sound, like a deep sigh or a groan from the very earth, emanated from the front of the bus. Mr. Henderson. He was still hunched over the wheel, his grip unyielding, but his head was tilted at an unnatural angle, his neck twisted. His skin, visible at the nape of his neck and along his jawline, was no longer the healthy tanned color Elara remembered. It was pale, almost translucent, and the faint, sickly green tint was now spreading rapidly across it, like moss growing on stone, deepening with every passing second. His eyes, in the rearview mirror, caught hers for a fleeting moment, and they glowed with the same unsettling green light as the trees outside. The bus slowed, the engine's hum deepening into a resonant drone, then came to a gentle, almost imperceptible stop. Not at a bus stop, not on a paved road, but in the middle of a clearing in the dark, ancient woods. The rain had ceased, as if on command, and an eerie, profound silence descended, broken only by the rhythmic thrum of the bus engine and the faint, unsettling hum that seemed to emanate from the very trees themselves, a low, hypnotic vibration. The bus door hissed open, not onto the usual asphalt and pavement, but onto a path of dark, damp earth, winding deeper into the woods, swallowed by the encroaching shadows. The air outside was thick with the cloying, sweet smell, now almost overpowering, a suffocating perfume that filled Elara's lungs. One by one, the passengers began to stir, not with a sudden jolt, not with the awakening of consciousness, but with a slow, deliberate movement, like puppets whose strings were being gently pulled by an unseen hand. They rose from their seats, their movements stiff and uncoordinated, their limbs moving with a jerky, unnatural grace. Their glassy eyes, still fixed straight ahead, held no recognition, no emotion, only that unsettling, blank stare. Timmy, his small body stiff and unyielding, stood up, his hand reaching out for Sarah's. Sarah, in turn, took his hand, her grip unnaturally firm, her fingers intertwining with his with a disturbing precision. They began to file out of the bus, a silent, ghostly procession of pale, unblinking children and teenagers, their faces devoid of emotion, their movements like automatons. They walked slowly, deliberately, down the path into the dark woods, their forms disappearing one by one into the deepening shadows, swallowed by the ancient trees. Elara watched them go, paralyzed by a terror that rooted her to her seat, a fear so profound it stole her breath. She wanted to scream, to run, to hide, to claw her way back to the world she knew, but her body wouldn't obey. Her muscles felt like lead, her will trapped within her own skull. The metallic taste in her mouth grew stronger, a bitter tang, and the faint, sickly green tint she had seen on Mr. Henderson's neck seemed to shimmer at the edges of her vision, encroaching, consuming. Then a voice, not a human voice, not a whisper, but a soft, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate from the very air around her, from the seats, from the floor, from the walls of the bus itself, from the engine, from the trees outside. It was the same tuneless, repetitive melody she had heard the little girl humming in her dreams, the one Liam had described, a melody that was both ancient and utterly alien. Come, the hum whispered, 1,000 voices in one, soft and inviting, yet filled with an ancient, unspeakable hunger, a promise of absorption, of becoming. It's time for your last stop. It's time to join us. Elara felt her own limbs begin to stiffen, a creeping paralysis spreading from her toes upwards, her head tilted to the side, involuntarily, her gaze fixing on the open bus door, on the dark path leading into the heart of the woods. Her eyes, she realized with a dawning horror that was quickly fading, were no longer focusing. They were becoming still, glassy, reflecting the flickering fluorescent lights with an unnerving intensity, mirroring the eyes of those who had gone before her. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips, a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, a smile that was not her own. The metallic taste in her mouth grew stronger, yet no longer unpleasant, but strangely comforting, familiar. The sickly sweet scent filled her lungs, not cloying now, but a soothing, intoxicating perfume. The green tint was spreading, a cool, soothing sensation across her skin, a transformation that felt less like a curse and more like a homecoming. She stood up, her movements stiff, deliberate like the others. She walked down the aisle, her bare feet. When had she taken off her shoes? She couldn't remember. Making no sound on the grimy floor, her steps silent, precise. She passed Mr. Henderson, still hunched over the wheel, his head now fully turned, his eyes glowing with the same unsettling green light as the trees outside. He looked at her, and a silent, knowing hum resonated from him, a greeting, a welcome to their collective. Alara stepped off the bus, onto the damp earth, the cool soil yielding beneath her feet. The air was cool against her skin, and the hum of the woods enveloped her, a lullaby, a welcome, a chorus of 1,000 silent voices. She joined the silent procession, her steps falling into rhythm with theirs, her gaze fixed on the winding path, on the glowing green eyes that awaited her in the shadows. She felt no fear, no sadness, no regret, only a profound sense of peace, of belonging. She was going home, to her new home, to join the others. The bus, its engine still thrumming with that low, resonant hum, sat silently in the clearing, its lights flickering, waiting for the next group of passengers. The last stop was never truly the last. It was just the beginning of a new journey, into the heart of the woods, into the silent, green embrace of the ancient, hungry things that waited there. And soon, another bus would arrive, another group of children, ready for their own last stop. The air in the Sundarbans was a suffocating shroud of humidity and the cloying scent of decay, a constant reminder of the relentless cycle of life and death that governed this ancient mangrove forest. Deep within its labyrinthine waterways and tangled roots, where the land bled into the sea, lived creatures of primeval power. Among them, 2 apex predators held dominion, their territories overlapping, their very existence a testament to the jungle's brutal beauty. Ka, the python, was a creature of immense age and size, his scales the color of ancient moss and dark river mud, perfectly camouflaged amidst the gnarled roots and hanging vines. He moved with a silent, undulating grace, his body a coiled engine of destruction. His eyes, cold and unblinking, held the wisdom of centuries and a chilling patience that could outlast any prey. His hunger was a slow, burning ember, rarely sated, always lurking. Shere Khan, the Royal Bengal tiger, was a force of nature, a magnificent beast whose stripes were like shadows cast by moonlight, his roar a thunderclap that echoed through the dense canopy. He was the undisputed king of his domain, his power absolute, his fury legendary. His amber eyes burned with an intelligent ferocity, and his movements were a symphony of raw strength and predatory cunning. His hunger was immediate, visceral, and always demanding. Their paths inevitably crossed, not in open conflict, for both were creatures of instinct, understanding the immense cost of such a battle. Instead, their encounters were tense, silent standoffs, a dance of dominance and subtle threat. Ka would lie coiled on a sun-dappled branch, a living part of the tree, as Shere Khan padded silently beneath, his massive paws barely disturbing the leaf litter. The tiger would pause, his nostrils flaring, sensing the serpent's presence, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Ka would remain motionless, his unblinking gaze fixed on the predator below, a silent challenge in his stillness. Then, with a twitch of a tail or a slow, deliberate uncoiling, one would concede, moving away, leaving the other to their solitary reign. But the Sundarbans was changing. A new scent began to permeate the humid air, something alien and unsettling. The acrid tang of burnt diesel, the metallic clang of distant machinery.
Humanos.
They were encroaching, pushing deeper into the mangroves, their boats churning the sacred waters, their axes biting into the ancient trees. This intrusion disturbed the delicate balance. Prey became scarcer, driven away by the noise and the destruction. The territories of Ka and Shere Khan, once vast and bountiful, began to shrink, their hunting grounds overlapping more frequently. The silent standoffs grew longer, more charged with unspoken aggression. One sweltering afternoon, a small group of poachers, their faces grim and determined, ventured deeper than any had before. They were after a rare species of deer, known to inhabit a secluded island within Ka's primary hunting grounds. They set their snares, their movements clumsy and loud, oblivious to the ancient eyes watching them from the shadows. Ka felt their presence, a discordant vibration in the earth, a crude disruption of his domain. He had encountered humans before, fleeting glimpses of their fragile forms, their strange, loud tools. They were a nuisance easily avoided, but these were different. Their scent was stronger, their intent more predatory. As dusk bled into night, the poachers made camp, their fire a beacon in the encroaching darkness. The smell of cooking meat, of human sweat and fear, drifted through the trees. Ka, driven by a hunger sharpened by the scarcity of prey, began to stalk them. He flowed through the undergrowth, a silent shadow, his scales brushing against the damp leaves, his body a ripple of muscle. Meanwhile, Shere Khan, also drawn by the scent of the humans and the promise of an easy meal, approached from the opposite direction. He had learned to fear humans and their fire sticks, but hunger was a powerful motivator. He watched from the dense foliage, his amber eyes gleaming, assessing the situation. The poachers, emboldened by their fire and their crude liquor, grew careless. One of them, a young, nervous man named Rakesh, wandered away from the camp to relieve himself. He stumbled through the thick roots, his flashlight beam dancing erratically, revealing nothing but the oppressive green. Suddenly, a shadow detached itself from the deeper gloom. Rakesh froze, his heart hammering against his ribs. He saw it then, a massive, muscular form, stripes rippling in the faint light. Shere Khan. A guttural growl vibrated through the air, shaking the very leaves on the trees. Rakesh screamed, a high-pitched, terrified sound, and turned to flee, but the tiger was too fast. With a single powerful leap, Shere Khan was upon him, a blur of teeth and claws. The scream was abruptly cut short, replaced by a sickening crunch of bone and tearing flesh. The other poachers, alerted by the scream, grabbed their rifles and machetes, their faces pale with terror. They fired wildly into the darkness, the gunshots echoing deafeningly through the silent forest. Ka, who had been closing in, paused. The sudden violence, the roar of the tiger, the sharp crack of the fire sticks. It was a disruption of his hunt, an invasion of his territory. He watched, his unblinking eyes observing the chaos. Shere Khan, having secured his prey, dragged Rakesh's body deeper into the undergrowth, away from the flashing lights and the deafening sounds. He began to feed, his powerful jaws tearing at the flesh, the sounds of his meal sickeningly audible in the sudden lull. The remaining poachers, huddled together, their faces streaked with sweat and fear, decided to retreat. They had lost one of their own, and the jungle had shown its teeth. They stumbled back towards their boat, their every step a desperate scramble. As they moved, Ka, his patience exhausted, decided to act. He had been denied his prey, and these humans were a persistent nuisance. He dropped from a low-hanging branch, his massive body landing silently behind the last man in line, a burly, superstitious man named Gopal. Gopal felt a sudden, cold pressure around his ankles. He looked down, his eyes widening in disbelief and horror. A thick, scaly coil was wrapped around his legs, tightening with terrifying speed. He screamed, a choked, gurgling sound, as Ka's immense body began to wrap around him, pulling him off his feet. His companions turned, their eyes widening in terror as they saw Gopal struggling, his body being slowly enveloped by the monstrous serpent. They fired their rifles, but their shots went wide, tearing through the leaves, doing nothing to deter the python. Ka, unperturbed, continued his deadly embrace, his coils tightening, crushing the life out of Gopal. The man's screams faded into a desperate gasp, then silence. The other poachers, their faces contorted with absolute terror, abandoned their friend and fled, scrambling through the dense undergrowth, their fear a palpable thing. Ka, having secured his meal, slowly dragged Gopal's lifeless body into the deeper shadows, his scales glistening in the faint moonlight. He began the slow, arduous process of consumption, his jaws unhinging, his body stretching to accommodate the large meal. As Ka fed, a new presence entered his immediate vicinity. Shere Khan, the tiger, having finished his own meal, had been drawn by the lingering scent of the humans and the subtle vibrations of Ka's feeding. He padded silently through the trees, his eyes fixed on the massive python. This was different from their usual encounters. There was no subtle dance of dominance now, only a raw, primal tension. Both were sated for the moment, but the intrusion of the humans had disrupted their world, pushing them into a closer, more volatile proximity. Shere Khan let out a low, challenging growl, a sound that vibrated through Ka's massive body. The python paused his meal, his head rising slowly, his unblinking eyes meeting the tiger's burning gaze. The air crackled with unspoken threat. Then, Shere Khan did something unexpected. He moved closer, not in aggression, but with a strange, almost curious intensity. He circled the feeding python, his tail twitching, his muscles coiled. He sniffed the air, taking in the scent of the human, the scent of the python, the scent of the disturbed jungle. Ka, for his part, remained still, his focus divided between his meal and the looming threat. He could sense the tiger's power, its immense strength, but he also sensed something else, a shared understanding, perhaps, of the true enemy. The tiger finally stopped, settling on his haunches a few yards away, his eyes still fixed on Ka. He let out a soft huff, a sound that was almost a sigh. It was a gesture of acknowledgement, of a truce, perhaps even a shared disdain for the two-legged creatures who dared to invade their domain. The jungle, for a moment, fell silent. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves, the distant calls of night birds, and the slow, rhythmic sounds of Ka's consumption. The poachers who escaped the Sundarbans never returned. They carried with them tales of unspeakable horrors, of a jungle that consumed men whole, of shadows that moved with terrifying speed, and of eyes that glowed red in the darkness. They spoke of a tiger whose roar shook the very earth, and a serpent whose coils could crush steel. Their stories, dismissed as the ravings of madmen, became whispered legends in the coastal villages, a warning against venturing too deep into the black mire. But deep within the Sundarbans, the ancient cycle continued. Ka and Shere Khan, the serpent and the tiger, continued their reign. The humans had brought disruption, had forced them into a new, uneasy understanding. The jungle had shown its teeth, reclaiming its own, and the two predators, in their own terrifying ways, were its instruments. They were the guardians of the deep, the silent, deadly response to humanity's relentless greed. And as long as the black mire held its secrets, and the earth bled its oil, the jungle would continue to whisper of the horrors that lurked within its embrace, waiting for the next trespasser. The silence of the Sundarbans was not empty, it was merely waiting. Kian Vance, a man whose rugged face bore the scars of 100 dangerous expeditions, adjusted the brim of his worn leather hat. His eyes, keen and unblinking, scanned the mist-shrouded jungle that stretched before them. He was a legend among the elite circle of big-game hunters, a man who had faced down charging rhinos and elusive snow leopards. But nothing, not even the most dangerous beast on Earth, compared to the quarry that lay hidden within this forgotten valley. Dinosaurs. His team, a motley crew of adrenaline junkies and seasoned professionals, stood beside him, their faces a mix of anticipation and thinly veiled fear. There was Kale, the hotshot tracker, whose lean frame belied a lightning-fast reflexes and an almost arrogant confidence. Dr. Anya Sharma, the paleontologist, whose quiet demeanor hid a fierce intellect and a burning desire to witness living history. And finally, Jax, the taciturn tech expert, whose array of sensors and drones was meant to ensure their safety. They had all been drawn here by the tantalizing whispers of a lost world, a place untouched by time, where prehistoric titans still roamed. The valley, known only as the Viridian Vale in hushed academic circles, was a geological anomaly, a pocket of primeval earth hidden deep within an uncharted region of the Amazon. Legends spoke of a place where the air itself was ancient, where shadows moved with a life of their own, and where those who dared to enter never returned. But Kian, driven by a thirst for the ultimate challenge, dismissed such tales as superstitious nonsense. He believed only in what he could hunt, what he could conquer. Their journey had been arduous, weeks of navigating treacherous rivers, hacking through impenetrable jungle, and battling relentless insects. Now, standing at the precipice of the valley, a low, guttural roar echoed from below, shaking the very ground beneath their feet. It was the sound of a Tyrannosaurus rex, a sound that should have been extinct for 65 million years. Magnificent, Anya whispered, her eyes alight with awe, despite the tremor in her voice. Magnificent and deadly, Kian corrected, unholstering his custom-built tranquilizer rifle. Remember the rules. Observe, document, tranquilize. No killing unless absolutely necessary for survival. Their descent into the valley was like stepping back in time. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth, decaying vegetation, and something else, something primal and musky, like ancient reptilian hide. Giant ferns brushed against their faces, and colossal trees, unlike any modern species, towered overhead, their canopies forming a perpetual twilight. The first few days were a hunter's paradise. They observed herds of lumbering brachiosaurus, their long necks reaching for the highest leaves. They tracked agile velociraptors, their chilling screeches echoing through the jungle. Kale, with his uncanny tracking skills, led them to watering holes where Stegosaurus grazed peacefully. Anya meticulously documented every detail, her camera constantly clicking. Jax's drones provided aerial surveillance, mapping the vast, unexplored terrain. Kian felt a primal thrill, a sense of being truly alive. This was the ultimate hunt, a test of skill and nerve against creatures that defied modern understanding. But then, the subtle anomalies began. It started with the dinosaurs' behavior. They weren't acting like mere animals. The herbivores seemed unusually agitated, constantly scanning the shadows, their massive bodies trembling. The predators, usually territorial and aggressive, sometimes paused, their heads cocked, as if listening to something beyond human hearing. Their eyes, usually feral, occasionally seemed to hold a strange, almost intelligent glint. One evening, as they set up camp near a roaring waterfall, Kian heard it. A faint whisper, just at the edge of hearing, like dry leaves skittering across ancient stone. It seemed to come from the very air, from the depths of the jungle. They awaken. He dismissed it as the wind, or perhaps the roar of the waterfall playing tricks on his ears. But the feeling of unease persisted. Kale, usually unflappable, reported strange occurrences. The tracks, Kian, he'd say, his voice low, they just end, like the creature vanished into thin air. And some of the prints, they're too deep, too heavy for the animal they belong to. Anya, too, noticed unsettling patterns. The flora, Kian, it's unnaturally vibrant. And some of the plants, they seem to pulse with a faint, internal light, especially after dark. It's not bioluminescence. It's something else. Jax's drones started malfunctioning. Their signals would cut out abruptly, their cameras displaying static or distorted images, fleeting glimpses of shadowy forms moving with impossible speed. Something's jamming the frequencies, Jax muttered, his brow furrowed. But it's not electronic interference. It's organic. The whispers grew louder, more distinct. They weren't just urges anymore. They were a chorus of ancient, guttural voices, seeming to emanate from the very earth itself. They spoke in a language none of them understood, yet it filled them with a profound sense of dread, a primal fear that resonated deep within their ancient instincts. One night, Kian woke to the sound of heavy breathing outside his tent. He grabbed his rifle, heart pounding. He peered through the flap. Standing just feet away was a massive triceratops, its horned head lowered, its eyes fixed on his tent. But its eyes weren't the dull, reptilian eyes of an animal. They glowed with a faint, sickly green light and held an unnerving intelligence, a malevolent awareness. He hunts, he takes. A whisper hissed in Kian's mind, seeming to come from the triceratops itself. Kian froze, his blood running cold. This wasn't just an animal. It was a puppet. The triceratops let out a low growl, then slowly turned and lumbered away, disappearing into the oppressive darkness of the jungle. Kian woke his team. He told them what he had seen, what he had heard. Kale scoffed, but Anya's face was pale. Jax, however, looked at his malfunctioning equipment with a new, terrifying understanding. "The energy spikes," Jax whispered. "They're not just jamming, they're influencing. The dinosaurs aren't just living here. Something is controlling them." Anya, her voice trembling, added, "The legends, the ancient spirits. What if they're not just stories? What if this valley is a nexus, a place where something primal, something beyond our comprehension, has been trapped for millennia and our presence has awakened it?" Their hunt had turned into something else entirely. They were no longer the predators. They were the prey. They decided to leave, immediately. But the valley, once an open wilderness, now felt like a cage. The path they had used to descend was overgrown, blocked by newly fallen trees. Jax's drone, sent to scout an escape route, returned with a horrifying image. The entire valley rim was now shrouded in an impenetrable, swirling mist, pulsing with that same sickly green light. They were trapped. The whispers intensified, becoming a constant, maddening drone in their minds. They spoke of ancient sacrifices, of a forgotten civilization that had worshipped the very energy that now permeated the valley. They spoke of beings that fed on fear, on life force, on the raw power of living creatures. The dinosaurs, once merely part of the ecosystem, now moved with a chilling, coordinated purpose. Herds of herbivores would stampede towards them, driven by an unseen force, their glowing eyes fixed on the hunters. Predators, including the terrifying T-Rex, would appear silently from the mist, their movements unnaturally precise, their roars filled with a malevolent intelligence. One afternoon, Kale, separated from the group while scouting, let out a piercing scream. Kian and the others rushed towards the sound. They found him pinned against a massive tree, a velociraptor standing over him, its clawed foot pressed against his chest. But the raptor wasn't attacking. It was simply staring at him, its green eyes glowing, its head cocked, as if waiting for a command. Then, a voice, ancient and resonant, echoed in Kian's mind. Not a whisper, but a clear, chilling command. "He is arrogant. He thinks himself master. Break him." The velociraptor's eyes flared, and with a sickening crunch, its clawed foot pressed harder. Kale's scream was cut short. Kian fired his tranquilizer rifle, hitting the raptor. It roared, momentarily disoriented, and stumbled back. Kian rushed to Kale, but it was too late. His eyes were wide and lifeless, his chest caved in. The entity was not just influencing, it was commanding. It was using the dinosaurs as its instruments of terror. They buried Kale quickly, their hearts heavy with grief and fear. The valley was feeding. As night fell, the terror intensified. The hum was deafening, vibrating through their very bones. The whispers screamed in their minds, promising pain, promising oblivion. Shadowy figures, indistinct and grotesque, began to coalesce in the mist, swirling around them, their forms shifting like smoke. They were the echoes of the ancient worshippers, perhaps, or the manifestations of the entity itself. They huddled together, their backs to a massive rock face, their weapons useless against the unseen force. The dinosaurs, their eyes glowing with malevolent green light, surrounded them, their roars a symphony of primal terror. Anya, her face streaked with tears and dirt, suddenly cried out, "The altar!" The legend spoke of an altar, a place of sacrifice. That's where the power is centered. Kian remembered the ancient stone altar they had found, its surface slick with dried blood. "Jax, can you overload something? Create a massive EMP? Anything to disrupt this energy?" Jax, his hands trembling, nodded. "Maybe, if I can get to the main power conduit, the one running through the altar. But it's a suicide mission. We have no other choice," Kian said, his voice grim. "It's either that or become part of this valley's collection." They made a desperate dash towards the altar, dodging charging dinosaurs and slithering shadows. The entity raged, its whispers turning into a furious roar that tore at their minds. The ground trembled violently. Trees crashed down around them. A velociraptor lunged at Anya. Kian shoved her aside, firing his rifle, but the tranquilizer had little effect. The raptor, its eyes burning, turned its attention to him. Jax, meanwhile, had reached the altar. He fumbled with his equipment, connecting wires, bypassing safety protocols. The air around him crackled with raw energy. The entity, sensing his intent, reacted with furious speed. The shadowy figures swarmed Jax, their icy touch burning. The dinosaurs roared, closing in. "Hurry, Jax!" Kian yelled, fending off the raptor with the butt of his rifle. Jax screamed as an unseen force slammed him against the altar. Blood trickled from his temple, but he pushed on, driven by a desperate hope. He reached the final connection. His finger hovered over the activation button. Then, a voice, ancient and resonant, filled his mind. A voice that was both a whisper and a roar. "You cannot defy us. We are eternal. We are the heart of this world." Jax, with a final, defiant cry, slammed his hand down on the activation button. A blinding flash of sickly green light erupted from the altar, followed by a deafening roar that shook the entire valley. The ground trembled violently, tearing itself apart. The air filled with the smell of ozone and something acrid, like burnt flesh. The dinosaurs shrieked, their glowing eyes dimming, their movements becoming erratic. The shadowy figures dissolved into mist. The hum faded into a profound silence. When the light subsided, the valley was still. The dinosaurs lay motionless, their forms still, their eyes dull and lifeless. The altar was shattered, its ancient stones cracked and smoking. Anya and Kian, battered and bruised, slowly pushed themselves up. Jax lay motionless beside the ruined altar, his body broken. He had succeeded. He had destroyed the entity, and with it, the life force that animated the valley. They were the only ones left. The other members of their team, consumed by the entity or crushed by the dinosaurs, were gone. They made their way out of the valley, climbing the treacherous, now silent, rim. They emerged into the familiar Amazonian jungle, the sun rising over the canopy, painting the sky with hues of orange and purple. The air was crisp, clean, free of the oppressive dread that had permeated the Viridian Vale. They never spoke of the Viridian Vale again, not to anyone. The experience had scarred them, leaving an indelible mark on their souls. They carried the memory of the whispers, the shadows, the ancient hunger that had lurked beneath the beautiful, deceptive surface of the Forbidden Valley. Kian Vance, the fearless hunter, was gone. In his place was a man who understood the true meaning of power and the terrifying cost of its corruption. He retired from hunting, his thirst for challenge replaced by a profound respect for the unseen forces of the world. Anya dedicated her life to studying ancient civilizations, seeking to understand the true nature of the entities that lurked in forgotten places. They were survivors, forever bound by the secret of the Viridian Vale, a silent testament to the horrors that lurk in the forgotten corners of the world, and the price of forbidden knowledge. The valley remained, a dark, brooding mass on the map, its secrets buried deep, waiting for the next curious adventurers to dare its depths. And sometimes late at night, when the wind whispered through the trees, Kian would swear he could hear it. Just at the edge of hearing, a faint metallic hum, a whisper carried on the wind, a chilling promise. But Kian Vance, the man, was no longer hunting. He was finally, terrifyingly aware. The rotor blades beat a furious rhythm against the storm-lashed sky, a desperate struggle against the unseen forces tearing at their small, private helicopter. Inside, the silence was thick with unspoken resentments, a stark contrast to the howling wind outside. The Miller family, Robert, the patriarch, his estranged wife, Sarah, and their 2 teenage children, Liam and Chloe, were on their way to a remote family therapy retreat, a last-ditch effort to mend the gaping fissures that had swallowed their once-united home. Robert, ever the pragmatist, gripped the armrests, his knuckles white. He'd insisted on this trip, believing the isolation would force them to confront their issues. Now, as the helicopter bucked violently, he wondered if he'd simply delivered them into a different kind of abyss. Sarah, pale and drawn, stared out at the swirling gray, her lips moving in a silent prayer. She'd opposed the idea, preferring the familiar comfort of their suburban home, however fractured. Liam, headphones clamped over his ears, was lost in a world of defiant music, his eyes fixed on the flickering instruments of the cockpit. Chloe, younger and more vulnerable, huddled in her seat, clutching a worn teddy bear, tears silently tracing paths down her cheeks. A sudden, jarring lurch threw them against their restraints. The pilot, a grizzled man named Captain Davies, wrestled with the controls, his face a mask of grim concentration. "Turbulence!" he barked over the roar. "Worst I've seen in years." Then came the sound. Not the wind, not the rotors, but a high-pitched metallic shriek, followed by a sickening thud. The helicopter shuddered, dropping like a stone. A warning light flared red on the console. "Engine failure," Davies yelled, his voice strained with panic. "We're going down." Chaos erupted. Robert lunged for Sarah, pulling her close. Liam ripped off his headphones, his eyes wide with terror. Chloe screamed, a raw, primal sound that cut through the mechanical death throes of the aircraft. The world outside became a blur of green and gray as they plummeted. Trees rushed up to meet them, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching for their demise. The last thing Elias heard before the impact was the shattering of glass, the tearing of metal, and the collective, desperate cry of his family. Then, darkness. He awoke to the stench of aviation fuel and damp earth. Pain, a searing, all-encompassing agony, ripped through his left arm. Groaning, he pushed against something heavy, realizing it was the twisted wreckage of his seat. He was upside down, dangling precariously. "Sarah, Liam, Chloe." His voice was hoarse, raw with fear. A faint moan answered him. "Dad?" It was Liam, his voice weak. "Liam, are you okay?" Robert struggled, his vision swimming. He could see the mangled remains of the cockpit, the pilot's seat empty. Captain Davies was gone. "My leg. I think it's broken," Liam whispered. "Sarah? Chloe?" Robert called again, desperation clawing at his throat. Silence. A terrifying, absolute silence, broken only by the drip of fuel and the distant whisper of the wind. He managed to unbuckle himself, falling awkwardly onto the damp jungle floor. The air was thick with the smell of crushed vegetation and something else, something metallic and acrid. He fumbled for his phone, but it was shattered. He crawled towards Liam, who was pinned under a section of the fuselage, his leg twisted at an unnatural angle. "Hold on, son. I'll get you out." It took agonizing minutes, pushing and pulling at the jagged metal, his injured arm screaming in protest. Finally, with a grunt, he freed Liam. The boy cried out, then slumped against his father, his face ashen. "Mom? Chloe?" Liam mumbled, his eyes darting around the wreckage. Robert's heart hammered. He scanned the debris, the torn seats, the scattered luggage. They must have been thrown clear. The words felt hollow even to him. They began to search, Liam hobbling, leaning heavily on Robert. The jungle was a suffocating maze, the darkness intensified by the thick canopy. The helicopter had crashed into a ravine, its pieces scattered amongst the dense undergrowth. "Mom!" Liam called out, his voice cracking. "Chloe!" A sound, a low, guttural growl. Both men froze. "What was that?" Liam whispered, his eyes wide. "I don't know," Robert said, his voice barely audible. He remembered the stories of this remote region, of the creatures that roamed its depths. They pressed on, calling out, their voices swallowed by the oppressive silence. Then Robert saw it, a flash of color. Sarah's bright red scarf, snagged on a thorny bush. He rushed forward, his heart pounding. And then he saw her, Sarah, lying motionless, half buried under a fallen tree branch. Her eyes were closed, her face peaceful, too peaceful. "Mom!" Liam cried, collapsing beside her. He reached out, his hand trembling, and touched her cold cheek. "No, no." Robert knelt, tears blurring his vision. The family was broken, truly broken now. As Liam sobbed, a rustle in the undergrowth caught Robert's attention. He looked up. Two luminous, yellow eyes stared back at him from the darkness. A puma. Its sleek, powerful body was barely visible, but its predatory gaze was unmistakable. It had been drawn by the crash, by the scent of blood and fear. "Liam," Robert whispered, "we have to go. Now." Liam, lost in his grief, didn't respond. Robert grabbed his son's arm, pulling him. "Liam, we have to move." The puma took a step forward, a low growl rumbling in its chest. With a desperate surge of adrenaline, Robert dragged Liam away from Sarah's body, deeper into the tangled undergrowth. They moved slowly, painfully, Liam's injured leg making every step in agony. The puma followed, a silent, relentless shadow. They stumbled through the night, the growls of the puma echoing around them, sometimes close, sometimes distant, a constant reminder of their precarious existence. Robert knew they couldn't outrun it. They needed shelter. He spotted a small cave, a dark maw in the side of a rocky outcrop. "In here," he urged Liam. They scrambled inside, pressing themselves against the cold, damp rock. The puma stopped at the mouth of the cave, its eyes glowing in the darkness. It paced, a restless, powerful presence, its growls reverberating through the small space. "Where's Chloe?" Liam whispered, his voice hoarse. "We have to find Chloe." Robert closed his eyes, a fresh wave of despair washing over him. He hadn't seen Chloe since the crash. The thought was unbearable. Hours passed. The puma remained, a patient, deadly sentry. Robert knew they couldn't stay in the cave forever. They would starve, or the puma would eventually find a way in. He thought about their family, about the arguments, the distance that had grown between them. He thought about Chloe, her bright smile, her innocent laughter. A fierce, protective instinct surged through him. He had to find her. "We're going to make a run for it," Robert whispered to Liam. Liam looked at him, fear and exhaustion etched on his face. "But the puma? We have no choice," Robert said, his voice firm. "We have to find Chloe." He found a sturdy branch, thick and heavy, and gripped it like a club. "When I say go, we run as fast as you can. Straight ahead." Liam nodded, his jaw set. Robert took a deep breath. "Now!" They burst from the cave, Liam limping, Robert swinging the branch wildly. The puma was caught off guard, leaping back with a snarl. They ran, blindly, desperately, through the darkness. The puma recovered quickly, its powerful strides closing the distance. Robert heard its heavy breathing behind them, felt the rush of air as it lunged. He swung the branch, connecting with something solid. A yelp of pain. They didn't stop. They kept running, the sounds of the jungle closing in around them. And then, a faint light, flickering through the trees. "A fire!" Liam gasped, hope surging through his voice. They stumbled towards it, crashing through the undergrowth. As they drew closer, they saw a small, makeshift camp and a figure huddled by the fire. "Chloe!" Robert roared, his voice raw with emotion. Chloe looked up, her face streaked with dirt and tears, but her eyes wide with recognition. "Dad! Liam!" She ran to them, throwing her arms around Robert. Then Liam. She was alive. She had survived. I built a fire," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I was so scared." Robert held her tight, tears streaming down his face. They were bruised, injured, and heartbroken, but they were alive. And for the first time in a long time, the fractured family felt a fragile sense of unity, forged in the crucible of shared terror. The puma's growls still echoed in the distance, a reminder of the jungle's unforgiving nature. But for now, they had found each other in the darkness. The whispering walls of the obsidian grand. Alara traced the condensation on the train window, the world outside blurring into a watercolor of greens and grays. Rain lashed against the glass, a relentless percussion that mirrored the anxious flutter in her chest. She was heading to the Obsidian Grand, a hotel whispered about in hushed tones, a place that existed more in legend than on any tourist map. Her grandmother, a woman of eccentric tastes and even more eccentric bequests, had left it to her. Not the hotel itself, but a single, sealed box, to be opened only within the confines of room 307. The instructions had been precise, almost ritualistic. Arrive on the eve of the autumnal equinox. Do not speak of your purpose. Do not leave room 307 after sunset until the box is open. And most importantly, Alara, do not listen to the walls. Alara had scoffed at the last part, dismissing it as her grandmother's usual dramatic flair. Now, as the train slowed, pulling into a desolate station that seemed forgotten by time, a prickle of unease crawled up her spine. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something metallic and cold, like old iron. A solitary, antique taxi, more hearse than cab, waited on the platform, its engine idling with a low, mournful hum. The driver, a gaunt man with eyes like chips of flint, merely nodded when she gave the hotel's name. The journey was silent, the road winding through dense, skeletal trees that clawed at the sky. The rain intensified, blurring the already dim light of the approaching dusk. Then, through a break in the trees, it appeared. The Obsidian Grand. It wasn't grand in the way of modern luxury hotels. It was grand in the way a mausoleum was grand. A towering, Gothic edifice of dark stone, its spires piercing the bruised sky like petrified fingers. Every window, hundreds of them, seemed to watch her, dark and empty, reflecting nothing but the gathering gloom. A faint, almost imperceptible shimmer seemed to cling to its ancient walls, as if the very air around it vibrated with an unseen energy. The taxi crunched to a halt on a gravel drive, the only sound the rhythmic drip of water from the eaves. "Here we are, miss," the driver rasped, his voice like dry leaves skittering across stone. He didn't offer to help with her single, worn suitcase. Alara paid him, her fingers fumbling with the damp bills, and watched him drive away, the taxi's tail lights vanishing into the rain-swept darkness, leaving her utterly alone. The massive oak doors of the hotel were closed, their dark wood gleaming wetly. No bell, no welcoming light. Taking a deep breath that did little to calm her racing heart, Alara pushed. The doors groaned open with a sound like a dying beast, revealing a cavernous lobby swallowed by shadow. The air inside was cold, stagnant, and smelled of dust, old velvet, and something faintly metallic, like blood or rust. Her footsteps echoed unnaturally on the polished marble floor. The lobby was vast, filled with heavy, dark furniture draped in white sheets, like ghosts awaiting resurrection. A grand staircase, its banister intricately carved with grotesque faces, spiraled upwards into impenetrable darkness. A single lamp flickered weakly on a reception desk in the far corner, casting long, dancing shadows. Behind it, a figure emerged from the gloom. The concierge was a woman, ancient and impossibly thin, her skin like parchment stretched taut over sharp bones. Her eyes, pale and watery, regarded Alara with an unnerving intensity. She wore a severe, old-fashioned uniform, black as the night outside. Room 307, I presume? Her voice was a dry whisper, like rustling paper. There was no warmth, no welcome. Alara nodded, too unnerved to speak. The woman pushed a heavy, ornate brass key across the counter. It was cold to the touch and surprisingly heavy. Elevator is to your left. 3rd floor. She didn't offer directions to the room itself, as if assuming Alara would simply know. The elevator was a cage of wrought iron, its ancient gears groaning as it slowly ascended. Each floor it passed was identical. A long, dimly lit corridor, lined with identical, dark wooden doors. The silence was absolute, broken only by the creak of the cables and the frantic thumping of Alara's own heart. When the elevator finally shuddered to a halt on the 3rd floor, the doors clanged open. The corridor stretched before her, a tunnel of shadows. The air here felt even colder, pressing in on her. She found room 307 at the very end, its number etched into a tarnished brass plate. The key slid into the lock with a soft click, and the door swung inward. Room 307 was large, dominated by a 4-poster bed draped in heavy, dark fabric. A single window, tall and narrow, looked out onto the endless rain and the blackness of the surrounding forest. The furniture was old, ornate, and covered in a fine layer of dust. A large, empty wardrobe stood against one wall, its doors slightly ajar, like a gaping mouth. A small, round table stood in the center of the room, and on it, exactly as her grandmother had described, sat a plain, unadorned wooden box. Alara set her suitcase down and approached the box. It was surprisingly light and completely sealed. No lock, no clasp, just smooth, unyielding wood. She ran her fingers over its surface, a strange tremor running through her. As she stood there, a faint sound reached her ears, a whisper. It was so soft, so subtle. She almost dismissed it as the wind or the settling of the old building. But it wasn't the wind. It was inside the room, an almost imperceptible murmur, like distant voices speaking just beyond the threshold of hearing. Do not listen to the walls. Her grandmother's warning echoed in her mind. Alara shook her head, trying to clear it. It's just the old building, she murmured aloud, her voice sounding thin and reedy in the oppressive silence. She unpacked quickly, needing the mundane act to ground herself. As she folded a sweater, the whisper intensified, becoming a low, continuous hum, like a swarm of angry bees trapped behind the plaster. It seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, from the very fabric of the room. Alara pressed her ear against the cold, rough wallpaper. The hum grew louder, and now she could almost distinguish individual sounds within it. Not words, not yet, but a cacophony of sighs, moans, and what sounded eerily like choked sobs. It was as if the walls were alive, breathing, suffering. Panic began to coil in her stomach. This wasn't just an old building. This was something else. She pulled away, her heart hammering against her ribs. She tried to ignore it, to focus on the box, on the task her grandmother had set her. But the whispers were relentless, a constant, insidious presence. They seemed to seep into her mind, filling the silence, eroding her composure. As darkness fully descended outside, the room grew colder. The single lamp she had found and switched on cast long, dancing shadows that seemed to writhe and stretch with a life of their own. The whispers grew louder still, coalescing, forming indistinct fragments of sound. She heard a child crying, a woman screaming, a man's guttural laugh, all muffled, distorted, as if filtered through layers of stone and time. Alara backed away from the walls, pressing herself against the heavy 4-poster bed. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for the source, for anything that could explain it. But there was nothing, only the ancient, silent furniture and the relentless, terrifying chorus from within the walls. She knew, with a chilling certainty, that she was not alone in room 307, and whatever was trapped within the obsidian grand, it was beginning to stir. The box on the table sat innocent, yet menacing, awaiting its opening. But Alara was no longer sure she wanted to know what secrets it held. Not if it meant listening to the tormented voices of the hotel's past. The night had just begun, and the walls were only just starting to speak. The air in Darklog Creek always hung heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth, a smell that clung to everything, especially the old, forgotten places. For Ethan, the scent was synonymous with fear. It was the smell of the woods that bordered the school, the woods where Mark and his pack often cornered him. Mark was a force of nature, a hurricane of muscle and malice. His eyes, the color of muddy river water, held a glint of cruel amusement whenever they landed on Ethan. Ethan, thin and pale, with eyes that always seemed to be searching for an escape route, was Mark's favorite target. Not because Ethan fought back. He never did. But because his fear was a tangible thing, a delicious aroma that Mark savored. It had started subtly in middle school. Tripped in the hallway, books scattered, a sarcastic remark about his worn clothes. By high school, it had escalated. Lunch money vanished, assignments were ruined, and the daily gauntlet of the school hallways became a terrifying ordeal. Mark, flanked by his two loyal, equally brutish lieutenants, Gary and Vince, ruled the social ecosystem of Darklog Creek High. Ethan's sanctuary was the old library, a dusty tomb filled with forgotten histories and whispered secrets. He spent every spare moment there, poring over ancient texts, particularly those about local folklore. The librarian, Mrs. Gable, a woman who looked as if she'd been carved from the very wood of the shelves, often found him there, lost in tales of the Darklog witches and the Whispering Woods, the very woods that tormented him. One frigid autumn afternoon, the bullying reached a new low. Mark had cornered Ethan behind the gym, a place usually deserted. This time, it wasn't just a shove or a stolen lunch. Mark held a small, intricately carved wooden bird, a gift Ethan had made for his ailing grandmother. "What's this, twig boy?" Mark sneered, twirling the bird by its delicate tail. "A little birdie for your little birdie brain?" Ethan's breath hitched. "Please, Mark, it's for my grandma." Mark's grin widened, revealing teeth that seemed too sharp. With a sickening snap, he broke the bird in half, then ground the pieces under his heel. "Oops," he drawled, feigning innocence. "Guess your grandma's out of luck." Something in Ethan snapped. Not outwardly, not in a burst of anger, but deep inside, a fragile thread of hope frayed and broke. He stared at the splintered wood, then at Mark's smirking face, and a cold, alien thought settled in his mind. They would pay. That night, Ethan didn't go home. He walked, not to the library, but to the edge of the Whispering Woods, the place he dreaded most. He carried the shattered pieces of the wooden bird. The air grew colder, the trees denser, their branches clawing at the bruised twilight sky. He found a small, overgrown clearing, a place that felt ancient and undisturbed. There, he dug a shallow hole, placed the broken bird inside, and covered it with earth. Then, he whispered words he'd read in an old, forgotten book, words about justice, about echoes, about the woods remembering. He wasn't sure what he was doing, only that a desperate, primal urge had driven him there. The next day, a subtle shift began. Started with Mark. During history class, a sudden, inexplicable chill swept through the room, making the hairs on Mark's arms stand on end. He shivered, blaming the old school's drafty windows. Later, walking home, he swore he heard his name whispered on the wind, a voice like dry leaves skittering across pavement. He spun around, but no one was there. Gary, Mark's most loyal follower, was next. He woke up one morning to find a small, perfectly carved wooden bird on his pillow. It was identical to the one Mark had destroyed, but this one was whole, its eyes seeming to gleam in the dim morning light. Gary, unnerved, threw it into the trash. The next morning, it was back, nestled neatly on his pillow, its wooden eyes fixed on him. He tossed it out again, but the pattern repeated. By the end of the week, Gary was sleeping with the lights on, convinced the bird was watching him. Vince, the third of the trio, began to experience more unsettling phenomena. Shadows in his peripheral vision seemed to deepen and move, taking on grotesque shapes. He'd be alone in his room, and the temperature would plummet, his breath misting in the air, followed by the faint, rhythmic sound of wood splintering, as if something was being slowly, deliberately broken. He started losing weight, his eyes perpetually wide with fear. Mark, initially dismissive of his friend's growing paranoia, found himself increasingly disturbed. The whispers intensified, sometimes sounding like his own name, sometimes like a low, guttural growl. He started seeing things, fleeting glimpses of a gaunt, shadowy figure at the edge of his vision, always just out of focus, always receding when he tried to look directly. The figure reminded him, chillingly, of Ethan. One night, Mark was alone in his room, trying to study, when the lights flickered and died. A profound, suffocating darkness enveloped him. He fumbled for his phone, but it was dead. Then, from the corner of the room, a faint scratching began, like nails dragging across wood. It grew louder, more insistent, until it sounded like something was trying to claw its way out of the wall. Mark scrambled backward, heart hammering against his ribs. The scratching stopped abruptly, replaced by a low, mournful creaking, like an old, heavy door slowly opening. A cold gust of wind swept through the room, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of damp earth and pine, the smell of the whispering woods. He fled his house, running blindly through the streets of Darklog Creek, the whispers chasing him, the image of the shadowy figure flickering at the edge of his vision. He ran until he reached the school, its dark silhouette looming against the moonless sky. He burst through the unlocked side door, seeking the false comfort of familiarity, the place where he had always been in control. He found himself in the deserted hallway, the lockers casting long, skeletal shadows. The silence was absolute, heavier than any sound. Then, from the end of the hallway, a faint, rhythmic tap-tap-tap began. It was the sound of something being dragged, something hard and unyielding, across the tiled floor. Mark's breath hitched. He strained his eyes, trying to pierce the gloom. A shape emerged from the darkness, slow and deliberate. It was a figure, tall and impossibly thin, dragging something behind it. As it drew closer, the tap-tap-tap grew louder, more distinct. It was Ethan, but not Ethan as Mark knew him. This Ethan was taller, his limbs elongated, his skin stretched taut over sharp bones. His eyes, usually downcast, were now wide and luminous, glowing with an unnatural, cold light. And what he dragged behind him was a large, gnarled branch, from which hung dozens, hundreds, of intricately carved wooden birds. They swayed gently, their tiny wooden eyes seeming to watch Mark. The air grew frigid, and the scent of pine and damp earth filled the hallway, overwhelming everything. The whispers returned, louder now, swirling around Mark, forming words he could almost grasp. Justice. Echoes. Remember. Ethan. Mark's voice was a ragged whisper, barely audible. The figure stopped, just feet away. The wooden birds on the branch clicked and clacked together like skeletal fingers. Ethan's lips, thin and pale, parted. His voice, when it came, was not his own. It was a chorus of dry leaves, of splintering wood, of 1,000 whispered secrets. You broke what was whole, the voice hissed, echoing in the vast emptiness of the hallway. You took what was given. The woods remember. Mark stumbled backward, his mind reeling. What are you? The glowing eyes fixed on him. We are the echoes of what you destroyed. We are the whispers of the woods, and we have come to collect. The shadowy figures he had glimpsed before now solidified, emerging from the deeper darkness of the hallway. They were gaunt, indistinct, their forms shifting like smoke, but their presence was undeniable. They moved with a slow, deliberate grace, surrounding Mark. He tried to run, but his legs were leaden. The cold seeped into his bones, a profound, ancient chill that promised to never leave. The wooden birds on Ethan's branch began to spin faster, faster, until they were a blur, their clicking a deafening roar in his ears. The last thing Mark saw was Ethan's face, no longer pale and fearful, but serene, almost peaceful, as the shadows closed in. The glowing eyes were the last thing he saw before the darkness consumed him, before the whispers became his own screams, unheard by anyone but the ancient, remembering woods. The next morning, Mark didn't show up for school, nor did Gary or Vince. The town buzzed with rumors, whispers of runaways, of families moving away in the dead of night. No one ever found them. Ethan, however, was back in school. He was still quiet, still spent his time in the library. But there was a subtle change. His eyes, though still reserved, held a new, unreadable depth. And sometimes, when the wind blew just right, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth, a faint, almost imperceptible clicking sound could be heard, like tiny wooden birds swaying gently in an unseen breeze. The whispering woods of Darklog Creek had claimed its due, and the echoes of justice lingered in the air, a chilling reminder that some debts are paid in darkness. The scent of turpentine and old oil paint clung to Joffrey like a second skin, a comforting, familiar shroud that had defined his existence for decades. His studio, a cavernous attic space in a forgotten corner of the city, was a testament to his life's work. Canvases stacked like forgotten tombstones, brushes bristling in terracotta pots, and the ever-present, almost living, hum of his own creative energy. Joffrey was an artist, not a celebrated one, but a true one, who poured his soul onto canvas, seeking to capture the elusive essence of beauty, pain, and the grotesque. Lately, however, his muse had taken a darker turn. It began subtly, with the shadows in his portraits deepening, the smiles of his subjects twisting into something less than benevolent. He dismissed it as a new phase, a natural evolution of his artistic voice. But then came the whispers, faint at first, like the rustling of old leaves outside his window. They gradually coalesced into distinct, insidious suggestions. They spoke of colors he'd never seen, forms that defied geometry, and a truth lurking beneath the veneer of reality that only he, Joffrey, was destined to unveil. His current project was a large, ambitious piece, a landscape of a desolate moor he'd visited years ago. He remembered the wind whipping across the heather, the sky a bruised purple, the ancient stones standing like silent sentinels. But as he painted, the moor began to shift. The stones seemed to writhe, their surfaces rippling with unseen currents. The sky bled into a sickly green, and the heather, instead of purple, pulsed with an unsettling, visceral red. The whispers grew louder, urging him on, praising his vision, condemning his doubts. Sleep became a luxury Joffrey could no longer afford. When he did drift off, his dreams were a maelstrom of distorted faces, screaming colors, and the relentless echo of the whispers. He'd wake in a cold sweat, his heart hammering against his ribs, only to stumble back to the easel, compelled by an invisible force. His hands, once steady and precise, now trembled with a manic energy, applying paint with a furious, almost violent, abandon. His few friends, mostly fellow struggling artists, noticed the change. His normally meticulous appearance gave way to paint-splattered clothes and unkempt hair. His eyes, once bright with artistic fervor, were now sunken and bloodshot, darting nervously as if tracking unseen entities. They tried to intervene to suggest rest, a break, perhaps even a doctor. Joffrey merely laughed, a hollow, rasping sound that sent shivers down their spines. "You don't understand," he'd croak. "I'm on the precipice of something monumental. They're showing me the way." The they he referred to were the voices, now constant companions, guiding his brushstrokes, dictating his palette. They told him the moor wasn't just a landscape. It was a living, breathing entity, a gateway to a realm beyond human comprehension. They told him the red wasn't just paint. It was the lifeblood of the earth, spilled by ancient, forgotten rituals. They told him the writhing stones were not stones at all, but petrified beings, trapped between dimensions. His masterpiece, once a landscape, was transforming into something monstrous. The canvas, once flat, seemed to bulge and recede in places, as if the very fabric of it were alive. The colors, once vibrant, now seemed to absorb the light, creating pockets of oppressive darkness. The The central feature, what was once a cluster of standing stones, had morphed into a gaping maw, its jagged edges lined with what looked disturbingly like teeth. Joffrey worked feverishly, forgetting to eat, forgetting to drink. His body became a mere vessel for the unholy vision that consumed him. The whispers had evolved into a chorus, a cacophony of voices that shrieked and sang, laughed and wept, all urging him deeper into the abyss. He no longer questioned their origin, their sanity. They were his truth, his only reality. One evening, as the last rays of the setting sun painted the studio in an eerie, blood-orange glow, Joffrey stepped back from the canvas. He stared, his breath catching in his throat. It was finished. The painting pulsed with an unholy energy, a swirling vortex of impossible colors and shapes. The maw in the center seemed to draw in the very air around him, and from its depths, he heard a new sound, a low, guttural growl that vibrated through the floorboards. He reached out, his fingers trembling, and touched the canvas. Felt warm, almost hot, beneath his fingertips. A jolt, like an electric shock, coursed through his arm, and he snatched his hand back. But the connection had been made. The painting wasn't just a painting anymore. It was a window, a portal, and something was stirring on the other side. The growl intensified, becoming a roar that filled the studio, shaking the very foundations of the old building. The colors on the canvas swirled faster, coalescing, solidifying. Joffrey watched, mesmerized and terrified, as the maw began to expand, tearing at the canvas itself, ripping through the threads with a sound like tearing flesh. A black, viscous tendril snaked out of the opening, dripping a corrosive fluid onto the floorboards, which hissed and smoked. Then another and another, until a dozen such appendages writhed in the air, seeking purchase. Joffrey stumbled backward, tripping over a stack of old sketches, his mind screaming in a silent, primal terror. From the expanding void, a form began to emerge. It was amorphous, shifting, a nightmare made manifest. Eyes, countless and unblinking, opened across its surface, reflecting the dim light of the studio with an alien malevolence. It was the creature the whispers had promised, the entity that resided beyond the veil, and Joffrey, in his madness, had given it a door. The air in the studio grew heavy, thick with an unbearable pressure. The stench of ozone and decay filled his nostrils, burning his throat. The creature, now fully emerged, towered over him, its form defying all logic, its presence a violation of every natural law. It was a living, breathing canvas of pure horror, and Joffrey realized, with a chilling clarity, that he was its first and perhaps only audience. He wanted to scream, but no sound escaped his parched throat. He wanted to run, but his legs were rooted to the spot, paralyzed by a terror so profound it transcended fear. The creature extended one of its tendrils, slow and deliberate, towards him. It moved with an unnatural grace, like a predator savoring its prey. As the tendril touched his forehead, a searing pain erupted in his skull, followed by a torrent of images, memories, and sensations that were not his own. He saw cosmic horrors, vast, indifferent entities lurking in the void between stars. He saw worlds consumed, realities unmade, and the chilling, eternal silence that followed. He saw the true face of the universe, and it was a face of absolute, unfeeling chaos. His mind, already frayed, snapped. The whispers, the voices, the delusions, all coalesced into a single, deafening shriek of pure, unadulterated madness. He felt his identity dissolve, his sanity unraveling thread by thread, until there was nothing left but the raw, screaming nerve endings of his being. When his friends, concerned by his prolonged silence, finally broke down the studio door days later, they found a scene of unimaginable horror. The studio was a ruin, furniture overturned, canvases shredded. The air was still thick with the acrid stench of something alien and foul. And in the center of the room, before the ruined, pulsating canvas, sat Joffrey. He was rocking back and forth, humming a tuneless, guttural melody. His eyes, wide and unblinking, stared at nothing, yet seemed to see everything. His hands, once instruments of creation, now clawed at the air, as if trying to grasp at the unseen horrors that still danced before his shattered mind. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated terror, yet etched upon it was also a strange, disturbing smile. The painting was gone, or rather, what remained of it was an impossible void, a tear in the fabric of reality that shimmered faintly before their eyes. They tried to speak to him, to reach him, but Joffrey was beyond their grasp. He was trapped in his own canvas of madness, a masterpiece of horror he had unwittingly created, and from which there would be no escape. The Whispers had finally claimed him, and in their victory, they had left behind only an empty shell, a monument to an artist who had dared to look too deeply into the abyss and found it staring back. The studio, once a sanctuary of art, was now a tomb of sanity, forever haunted by the echoes of Joffrey's descent.